Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this briefing event about the Creative Industries Clusters Programme. I'm Andrew Chitty. I'm the AHRC's Creative Economy Champion. What a great title that is. I was just going to give you an outline of what, how we're going to run the day. So I'm going to pop up and down and kind of MC. We're having some keynotes before we do the briefing. The important part of that for us is to set the scene and get the message across about what a distinct initiative this is. So I think, Anthony Lilly, who's been with it right from the start, right from the inception of this idea, will orient to that. Then we've got Michael Contaldo and Alex McDowell giving us very different perspectives, I hope, that will be food for thought of the different things that you could bear on this programme. Then myself and the AHRC team will do the briefing and take questions, and then we're going to have a panel. Again, once we've done the briefing, Anthony will try and tease out some of the challenges and some of the differences about this programme. Hopefully, lots of Q&A, lots of chance also for you to network. We're very well aware as we go around the country that there are conversations very live and underway. We hope that today will influence those conversations, because otherwise why would we be here? But also they'll influence them in terms of helping you focus and tease out some things that will make successful bids into this competition. So let's get the thing underway. I'm going to introduce Anthony Lilly. Anthony, many of you know as a creative producer through Magic Lantern, but also in not only in the digital space, but also in the performance space. Anthony's also a member of the AHRC's council, and I think absolutely core to the evolution of this idea as a new kind of research programme. So, Anthony.
Hello, nice to be on home turf, more or less. Thanks, Andrew. So that was a nice intro. It's also accurate, which is helpful. So I started life in theatre. I then became a digital media entrepreneur and producer. Founded a company called Magic Lantern. We used to find ourselves mostly pitching against Andrew Chitty's company Illumina for everything we ever did, and occasionally winning them. And I have a certain sort of role in academia. I have a chair at the University of Ulster in creative industries, and I also, as Andrew said, am a member of the AHRC Council. So I joined the council towards the end of the period when the AHRC investment in the knowledge economy hubs, the four hubs, were active, which many of you will know about. I wasn't involved in them, although I did have some kind of input in the sort of wash-up process. But as a council member, I was in the lead, really, working with Andrew Thompson when he arrived as the chief executive of the AHRC to think about AHRC's strategy longer term. And to think about that with the team in the HRC in terms of what we should do about creative industries generally, building to some extent on what we learned from the hubs investment that we made. But also we took a step back and said, actually, what does it mean to be a research council? What does it mean to be working with HEIs and the creative industries? What sort of thing do we need? And so actually about a year ago, we were on a different tour, 3 or 4 date tour, and we were here in Manchester at one point on a consultative exercise, talking with quite a lot of industry people and also people from academia about a sort of strategic approach which we might take to creative industries based around identifying challenges in the creative industries and trying to match our investment against research challenges which were live for people working in the creative industries. And then the government published the industrial strategy. It's not a great read, to be fair. It's not even a great industrial strategy, probably, but it has some really good bits from our point of view, in that for probably the first time in my career, and sort of on the side, I've been involved in policy around creative industries from various roles throughout most of my career on IP and copyright, and as a member of one of the boards at Ofcom and various things. So for kind of the first time, creative industries, the figures and the statistics that you'll see a lot of today and know a great many of in any case, were deemed to be not necessarily all lies, which was a wonderful start compared to the position we'd traditionally been in of trying to explain that actually there were a lot of people working in the creative industries. Actually, they did generate quite a lot of value added. Actually, they were, quotes, proper jobs, and which my mum still asks me. I'm 47, my mum still asks me when I'm getting a proper job. So these were all true now, and that actually for the first time in the industrial strategy, this was acknowledged as a sector, as a significant sector with a priority, which was testament to the work of a great many people over a long time, and also to the fact that the industrial strategy was listening. But it was quite hard work to get to that point. And in fact, Alex Vincent, who's in the room, who's our newly arrived at AHRC Associate Director, who looks after this whole programme, and digital humanities for AHRC. She was at the kind of Research UK, the sort of superpowered body, fighting our case to make sure creative industries was involved. And now we've got her on the programme. It's great. So we got in at that point, and then the really hard work started, which was to try and work out what kind of programme we could bid against. And now the industrial strategy is a £4 billion investment. It's real money. It's proper money. And the investments are made in waves. So we bid into wave 1 at a hell of a speed. It took most of last autumn and quite a lot of the spring. And this investment, which Andrew will take you through the details of, was successful in wave 1. So we made it through the first round. We are also right now involved in another bid to wave 2, which is in the last shortlist. So there could be another piece of work as well, which will have some relationships maybe to what we're doing here. We can't go into that because it's not true yet, or not a fact yet. So we were successful with this idea, and so my kind of starting point for you this morning is just to very bluntly, because I'm from Bolton, give you a perspective on what this programme is, what it's for, and what it isn't. And this is less subtle than you'll hear later, but it might be a good place to start from. So when we were making the case in Bays, in the Treasury, and with the support of the Department for Culture, Media, and also Sport, as they say in W1A, which is brilliant, isn't it? Olympics are done now. When we were doing that process, what was very, very significant was this is not ordinary research money. This money is industrial strategy money. It has objectives around growth. It has objectives around job creation. It has objectives around the long-term structure, the architecture, if you like, of the innovation and research landscape and the skills landscape that HEIs play into and that is specific to the creative industries. So there are elements, for instance, of the need for a creative case for diversity in there because they are strategic approaches to those questions. But that's the kind of money it is. It is, in the jargon, it is very, very hypothecated money. It has a job to do. There will be measurements based on the job it has to do. I spend time at both ends in this role because I chair the programme with Alex. I chair the whole programme. I spend part of my time with two kinds of people who call themselves VCs, vice chancellors at one and venture capitalists at the other. And the meetings are very interesting and different and also have commonalities. So quite a lot of the vice chancellor meetings begin with, but Anthony, that's not really how research money works. So that isn't normally what we do. The Haldane Principles, Research Council funding, all that stuff. And the venture capitalists say, but what a colossal waste of money. You should give it to companies that are just ready to grow, and us. This usually comes down to give it to us. And same with the VCs at the other end, to be honest. Give it to us, we'll make it work. And in fact, this fund is very specifically positioned between those two positions for very good reasons. That's what the industrial strategy is trying to do. This money is not new research money in the old model, but it is new money that plays into the skills capacities of our research base and crucially to the way that this sector can grow, I think. So it's very particularly that. Now, in my other AHRC roles, I had the great honour and political excitement of chairing the Doctoral Training Partnerships Programme. Those of you who know what that is will know quite what a hospital pass that job is. This is not that. So in the DTP's programme, groupings of universities come together, they decide their disciplinary specialisms, and essentially the country is kind of gently massaged into a shape that works so that the funding is spread out and functions effectively across the system. This is not that kind of money. You can't win a cluster bid by being universities that always get AHRC grants. You have to work extremely tightly with the industry. These are partnerships led by HEIs. Industry people must be involved at all levels, including governance. And there's a symbolic thing you need to ponder, if you haven't clocked it from the documentation. The director does not have to have a research track record. There is no requirement for a publications list as long as your arm for the director of the partnership, which means it could be somebody from industry, or it could be somebody from a different part of the academic landscape, or it could be somebody from policy. It could be all manner of people, kinds of person. But it does have to be somebody who can hold together a partnership which contains innovative companies, researchers, and which is working on a specific challenge. And that's the next bit to come to. The need for a challenge, which means it's got a question mark on the end and it is capable of being answered. I'm sorry to be facetious, but it isn't whether the future of the creative industries. It has to be something which is capable of noticeable improvement or some kind of development in the answer over the time of your grant or our investment. The notion of the challenge is I know it's very voguish at the moment in policy and in funding landscapes. Everything's suddenly a challenge. But when we talked to industry players a year ago, one of the great tolling bells, messages coming back was, we can't work on critical studies of our industry. This is research for and with the creative industries, not primarily about the creative industries. So that takes me to one other area I'll be quite blunt on. The hubs were successful in their own terms, and we learned lots of interesting things. There were lots of things we learned about them which have been brought into this program, the KE hubs. But their focus was predominantly on how to collaborate and mechanisms for collaboration and very large questions. And a lot of the work was with cultural institutions. Now, there's an elephant in the room, so I'm going to talk about it, again, in the traditional Bolton way. This project is not about, this funding is not about the provision of cultural value, as the HRC would describe it. Now, clearly, there is no distinction between creative industries outputs, and they all have some cultural component of whatever kind. So we're not saying that this is only about enabling technologies or etc. But we are saying that if the primary output of what you do is a social, political, cultural output, the strings that are attached to this funding about growth and jobs are going to be quite attenuated. It's going to be quite difficult to prove that you're dealing with this kind of money. So that isn't saying you can't work with cultural institutions, and cultural institutions in the room are not relevant. Of course they are. Some of them are at the peak of supply chains. So there's one in the room I happen to know about called the BBC, which is why I did the W1A joke. It's a publicly funded institution with a colossal impact on commercial supply chains, and which helps drive UK television exports, UK technology, etc. So it isn't that there can't be public partnerships. The same is true of some of the big museums and galleries. You may be an innovative display technology company working in a gallery context. You may then find yourselves to be the world's greatest installation company for VR or immersive or augmented in galleries. And that can be a commercial business. But the primary of course it can. The primary outcome cannot be solely cultural value, solely social value. I'm sorry it can't. I'm a former trustee of an opera house. If you can think of something that is less commercial and cultural value, it's a challenge I like throwing out. It's a subsidy context. I would like there to be more of that kind of money. This is not it, and I might as well say that at this point. So you have to be clever, you have to be subtle, you have to understand the ecosystem of your cluster and the role of the cultural partners in there, which probably means if you come with the same partnership that you've had for a specifically purely AHRC cultural sort of program before, it's going to be lacking something. And that's one of the reasons we're here today, is to make these things really clear. It's a challenging program, this. It's risky. it's exciting, but it isn't business as usual. And that's why we are out listening and talking. And I think what the feedback we're getting is the core documentation we've produced is not business as usual documentation, but it also leaves quite a lot of questions. Some of them are deliberately left open. Some of them we don't yet know the answer to. And therefore, you're part of the kind of helping us answer the questions. So that's the context of what we're trying to do. It's the single biggest investment ever made in creative industries research in this country. We've made specific promises about what it will deliver. The only thing that keeps me awake at night about this programme is that if we don't think about these things early and configure it correctly, I'll be in front of the Public Accounts Committee explaining what happened to the best part of £100 million, along with others. And so we're reaching out to you guys and to the people that we work with to find exciting challenges, brilliant partnerships, and to really use this kind of money to drive the clusters. So hopefully you'll have a good morning, interesting day. I'm going to hand it out to Andrew. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. So hopefully I'm looking at people who have received some of the messages that Anthony we're trying to get across. So there's a risk today that we might repeat things very several times. Now, there's two possible interpretations. One is we're not really good at doing event and slide packs and things like that, and we accidentally put those things in and didn't notice how repetitive it was. And the other possibility is we actually mean it. So I'd encourage people to just play around with the idea that if there's a repeated message, we probably do mean it. That doesn't mean it can't be questioned, of course. So, Anthony, right at the heart of this programme is the idea of economic growth through creative R&D. And that moves us very neatly towards our two keynotes. So one of the contexts of this, obviously, is clusters. So there's a regional element or a cluster element to regional economic growth. And the other is the what. What is the creative R&D we can do? So our first keynote is Michael Contaldo, who's Deputy Director, Innovation and Science Commercialisation at the Combined Authority in Greater Manchester. So I think Michael hopefully brings us a couple of things. One is a background in the Treasury. So it's very interesting that within the new regional architecture that we are starting to work with across the UK in terms of the combined authorities, we have people who have expertise in the higher central government strategic functions. So Michael's going to talk to us about the creative industries in Greater Manchester. At this point, it would be wrong for me not to say other combined authorities are available. This is, of course, a briefing for institutions and partners across the north and the northwest. But I think what we're trying to do here is take the opportunity of exploring what that means from a policy-making point of view within a combined authority cluster.
So, as we said, I'm going to talk a bit about Greater Manchester. So I recognise that actually many of you will come from a slightly wider footprint than the city. But I think hopefully some of the issues, some of the opportunities, some of the challenges will kind of resonate more widely and there kind of be a sense to kind of stimulate some of the discussion later on, perhaps. To start off really with the slides. The picture there actually is from the Department of International Trade, so that's not Greater Manchester claiming Paddington and the TARDIS, that is the trade. But it's kind of showing actually the increasing awareness by central government as well as regional and local government of the importance in terms of the trade opportunities from creative content, from the creative industries, actually, about Britain's image overseas. For those of you not familiar, just to kind of say very briefly what the Greater Manchester Combined Authority is about. This is a set of the 10 boroughs for Greater Manchester, having worked really over the last couple of decades very closely together on a set of common issues. And this sort of crystallised this year in April, where the organisation effectively took form along with a Greater Manchester mayor. So Andy Burnham appointed the first Combined Authority mayor. The workforce coming together and kind of sort of beginning to sort of interact between the kind of different sorts of cross streams, the low carbon, the health colleagues, the public service reform colleagues, to try and give a more holistic approach to some of the challenges facing the citizens of Greater Manchester and some of the opportunities really. And alongside us work organisations like the Business Growth Hub, so they are aimed at supporting businesses within the Greater Manchester footprint to help them access finance, to help them grow, to understand export opportunities, to kind of give them that mentoring support, and also Midas as part of the organisation as well, which has a kind of inward investment perspective. And my role within that is as head of innovation and science commercialisation, so looking really at how we grow the economy by really kind of continuing to invest in our research, our strengths, our science excellence, our kind of innovative firms, in order to generate GVA and employment growth over the future years. And there is a strategy, the Greater Manchester strategy we have in place, which we are working towards and which is being reviewed at the moment, that kind of gives us those benchmarks and outputs that we aim to kind of deliver by 2030, 2050. As was mentioned, my background to this is a civil servant, so I come to this from the Treasury, and it's really quite interesting actually at how far the debate on the creative industries has progressed, because one of my first roles back in 2001 was working with DCMS, and actually working with them to put in place a strategy for the creative industries. There wasn't one back there. There was actually not a very good awareness of what necessarily constituted the creative industries in terms of that evidence base. So really, I sort of worked with them to kind of put that in place for the first time, and now it's sort of seeing the real sort of fruits of that in terms of kind of developed sort of work like the program, a cluster program that we're looking at today. And then just really, I think, just to kind of set some parameters about where we are and what we're talking about, really. This is sort of the definition, I suppose, for the creative industries which central government has kind of put in place. And I think probably it's not intended to be exclusive and rigid, but I think it kind of gives us a sense of some of the things that maybe it's not. But I think increasingly, actually, part of the debate is not to look at these things as, you know, as a sector or subsectors in isolation. Actually, I think the interesting part is the contribution they make to the wider economy. Actually, it's about the interaction of that creative content with other parts of the economy, which I think would generate the real kind of stimulation to growth. So actually, what can we learn about design and how that contributes to manufacturing and advanced manufacturing, automobiles, aerospace, for example? How can we kind of use creative content to look at health applications and be kind of smarter and more efficient about how we approach that? So there's real opportunities, I think, to look more broadly at this. And then I just kind of wanted to talk a bit about some research that we've done over the past couple of years, actually, looking specifically at the creative industries, really trying to map and understand and build the evidence in order to kind of help us then make the right policy interventions, make the right investments to support and grow this sector. And New Economy has now been subsumed into the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, but provided sort of a research function. And in 2016, it produced a series of deep dives, really, which were partly there to inform the development of the Greater Manchester strategy, one of which we looked at the digital and creative industries. So not just creative industries, we kind of brought it in with digital, which is kind of interesting, the way that was packaged, but then also looking at manufacturing, health, etc., to really kind of understand where our strengths are, what the growth potential is, and therefore what we need to do, what the steps are between now and 2030 to kind of help realise that ambition. And so these are now feeding into that kind of sort of economic growth service reform discussions. There are obviously opportunities, I think, to kind of drive this work forward through the unique governance arrangements that we have in Greater Manchester in terms of a combined authority that is a kind of a stable set of decision making, but also health devolution, for example, allows control by Greater Manchester leaders over £6 billion of health and social care spending. So actually, we can start to be a bit smarter about some of the innovations we bring into some of our services and think a bit more creatively about how we do that in order to have more citizen centric services. And then kind of sort of some of the key assets which I'll kind of go on to a bit more detail shortly, but they're obviously things like Media City UK over in Salford Quays. 1 in 7 BBC staff now work there, particularly specialisms around digital applications. You know, it was very controversial, I think, when it was first mooted sort of a decade ago now, but actually has proved its success. Actually, I think has demonstrated that it can deliver value for money. And that concentration has seen sort of a supply chain, if you like, a wider clustering, a kind of growth of sort of firms, and but also actually the universities and skills kind of package around that more generally. There's been some talks recently about possibly Channel 4 moving up, but we know that's still to be decided. But that could be quite interesting in terms of kind of building that. And there's also kind of obviously a clustering of kind of arts and culture there with the Lowry and the Imperial War Museum designed by Daniel Liebeskind. There are some other projects as well. I think I've kind of sort of identified some of those: the Sharp project, the Space project, the corridor where you have MMU and the University of Manchester in particular, series of assets. The Northern Quarter, I think, is very interesting, and many of you will be familiar with about, this kind of independent set of businesses in particular, without actually very much public sector direction or state control. Actually, this is kind of mushrooming and growing into quite a dynamic part of the city, and the St John's Quarter that's being built down by the river may potentially also, emulate that. The role, I think, also worth bearing in mind about the international aspect of some of this. Again, it comes back again and again, I think, actually, that we're not need to looking just slowly at the local and indeed the regional repercussions. Actually, the creative industries has a global reach, and actually, the more we think about the opportunities from trade and investment, I think that the more valuable on that, and certainly having organisations like these help us to do that. And then the evidence, going back to the evidence, so looking at what we discovered, 4,340 businesses were based within Greater Manchester, so actually significant density here. 2/3 of all firms in the creative industry sector across the northwest are focused here. 26,000 jobs, at least, although again it's not necessarily easy to measure some of these things because of the size of the businesses. So significant from a regional perspective, I think. And of course, having the airport here in Manchester kind of helps, again, build some of those international linkages. And then some of the opportunities and challenges which many of you hopefully will recognise from some of the wider geographies, really. As new platforms emerge, there are, I think, increasing demand, as we know, from gaming, from film, from TV and advertising, for actually this kind of creative production. And the proliferation of platforms and services creating that demand for independent production. So there is, we see this very much as a sector that will only continue to expand, continue to grow, continue to interact with other bits of the economy, and actually, therefore, we need to kind of support that as far as we can in terms of the policy perspective. But it's there is a question about the extent to which it is genuinely a sector. A kind of one thing, actually. I think many of you probably feel that actually it is quite a bit of variation in the way that it's constructed, and actually I don't think we do it justice in terms of kind of putting it all in one umbrella. So it's understanding the nuances of that, really, and I think sometimes some of the data can disguise some of the issues if we're not careful, really, particularly in terms of kind of the size, the variation in size, or indeed in issues such as productivity. We find that certain aspects, certain key subsectors kind of have lower productivity compared to others, so actually require slightly different interventions. And there we're given sort of an average figure that we found of GM creative industries of a GVA of 37.3 thousand compared to the national average of 42.6. So there is an issue there. I think actually we kind of want to think about there in terms of kind of the skills or maybe the infrastructure to support that. And I think an important point is to make out that we're talking mainly about micro and small businesses here. 90% of this sector is micro businesses. That's less than 9 people. Actually, only 0.2% of firms within the Greater Manchester region are large, i.e. 250 plus employees. So again, that kind of, I think, is an important point to make. And it's a highly competitive, a highly mobile sector, and a set of kind of skilled people. So actually, we need to kind of be aware that there are issues around intellectual property, about intangibles, about mobility, about skills, that actually constantly need to kind of think about, and making sure we have the right policy framework and the right set of interventions to make us as attractive as possible to locate here within Greater Manchester, within our geography. And actually, this is tying up to the need to look at place as well. So actually the attractiveness of place, the livability, to address some of these challenges around affordability of space. So particularly the impacts of regeneration can sometimes start to create sort of a bit of an issue in terms of availability of production studios or space where creative industries can kind of operate. So actually being smarter about understanding the pinch points there and having the right planning policies in place, I think, would be quite important, as well as, of course, thinking about the connectivity, making sure we have good digital infrastructure and good kind of skills base. And then this table really is to kind of just give you a sense of some of the kind of the concentrations of the specialisms within Greater Manchester. This report, this deep dive, is available on the New Economy website, so it is all there. And I suggest you to kind of take a look at it if you want to sort of really understand sort of some of the detail. But there are some specific concentrations where we know Greater Manchester performs pretty well. So the first one there, printing and reproduction of recorded material, is strong. And the programming and broadcasting activities, actually, that is stronger than national average. the lower the figure, sort of the weaker the concentration in terms of the clustering, and this goes back to kind of agglomeration economics, the ability of firms to have proximity to one another in order then to kind of stimulate innovation, to make linkages, to kind of support, to grow. There are benefits that we've measured about agglomeration effects really, and the importance of clustering. And then this map is intended really to show you kind of some of the spatial issues really in terms of the Greater Manchester perspective. So this map is around the number of firms or local units really, and the darker the colour, the higher the concentration of firms. So I think that kind of shows that really that there is a concentration of the creative industries as you would expect within the regional centre, within the city centre, but there are other parts out to the west in Salford Quays, and for any of you who haven't been there, I kind of strongly suggest you go and take a look at the Media City stuff. And then down into Trafford as well, so you've got Trafford Park and Altrincham down there in the red, for those of you kind of familiar with that. But again, I think actually, what does this show? This shows us that there are hotspots and concentrations, but there are also secondary centres that we need to be aware of actually, around Wigan and around Rochdale, and in Bolton there are some important kind of secondary clusters there, but also actually the geography is not Greater Manchester confined. Actually, we shouldn't really be thinking of this as kind of artificial administrative boundaries. Actually, there are a really good set of kind of functional economic geography into Lancashire, into particularly South Lancashire and into East Cheshire. So actually that wider set of relationships is really important. If you look at the travel to work patterns of something like Media City, actually, it's kind of quite a wide arc. So again, those kind of wider set of collaborations I think are very important. And this is the employment, this slide shows the employment density, really, the concentration, where again you'd expect the kind of the clustering to map the firm map, but actually, because I think of the concentration of big organisations like the BBC and ITV, actually you sort of see the red around Salford Quays and the city centre being kind of slightly stronger there in terms of the employment specifics. And then finally, really, it's kind of sort of to show that we've been thinking about sort of some of the assets. So again, actually being aware of what assets and strengths we are, where they're located, in order to kind of then create the right connections. The BBC, there's 2,600 staff working in 26 departments at Media City, a centre for digital technology and home to the iPlayer. You've got the Northern Quarter, 150 digital and creative companies, including Mad Lab, where we was at a meeting earlier this week. So, kind of quite a dynamic set of issues. There's a number of university-supported assets here, I think, particularly the landing and the stuff that the University of Salford MMU are doing, but also the CityVerve project, which is about looking at the Internet of Things, and really it's £10 million to sort of trial new creative ways of addressing citizen type services, and that could be kind of quite interesting, the applications that begins to deliver and develop. And then that final slide there, just really kind of some of those assets, some of those key assets, I suppose, from a spatial perspective. And I think, as the point was made earlier, these are enhanced. These are kind of supported by some of the wider cultural offer that we have in terms of the factory that's being built, but also the Whitworth, the Halle, the home. So actually, there is the ability to kind of interact, I think, with some of the creative industries and some of the cultural organisations, I think, to kind of bring the benefits of that. And then the final point I wanted to make, I guess, was around the Northern Powerhouse. Actually, Greater Manchester is part of a much bigger set of opportunities, particularly with some of the core cities, Liverpool, Sheffield, Leeds, Newcastle. And actually, how we think about how our creative industries operate across that wider landscape, I think will be quite valuable, because then that kind of gives us that profile, that scale, to really begin to kind of take effect at that national but also international level, where I think actually that is going to bring the biggest the opportunities and contributions to growing the economy. So thank you very much indeed. As I said, if you want to have a look at any of that is available on the website, but I'm very happy to point people to that or answer any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. I think that's it's a really, really good start to remind us of really the kind of level of understanding that's now present within the potential economic partners of a programme like this. And to also remind us of this, in some ways what we're trying to do here, one element of it has got a really large spatial component. It's this kind of exercise in economic geography, and I think to remind us of the different players within that geography, the different levels of data that we have to understand, the role of hubs, the role of kind of anchor tenants or key assets, both commercial and cultural assets that we need to bring together is really, really helpful. So now I'd like to move on to the other side of the project, which is what the hell are these research partnerships going to do? And when I became involved in this with Anthony, within about a week of starting, two people that I really respect, one a kind of design guru and one an academic, both independently said to me, you know, if you really want to address what would be a new research approach to this that comes out of the creative industries, there's one person you should meet. And I said, okay, then who's that then? And they said, you should meet Alex McDowell. So it's taken until this morning to finally meet face to face. So, and the reason for that, I think, is that Alex has this unique background as an A-list production designer in film. Some of the most, important in terms of the way we think about the future films, or the films that you'll remember and apply their design into your life of the last 20 years. Particularly, Minority Report, Fight Club. It's a pretty fantastic list. But also, Alex has worked more recently as an academic, bringing together the various strands that bear on how we tell stories about the world and how we think about the future, not only the future of design, but the stories that inform us of how we think about the world itself, and work both with corporate and with academic researchers from different disciplines. And let's face it, he's also created the coolest name for any academic institution that I've ever come across, which is the World Building Institute. So here, to tell us, give us some insight into what we might do with this programme, what approaches we might bring to it, and how we might do some great creative research, is Alex McDowell.
So I'm a little jet lagged, so excuse me if I start talking complete rubbish, just wave and say shut up and what do you mean? So I'm based in LA. I've come out of industry. I come out of film industry, having started in London as a painter at Central School, moved into the music industry 1976, which is kind of why I'm here, because Malcolm Garrett and I were both running record sleeve design studios in London. And then just by accident, like many of the things in my life, I made Iggy Pop's first music video, and that started taking me to the States, and I went to do a Bananarama video, and I never came back. So I've gone from 30 years in film that came out of that music video, and then again sort of found myself abruptly in academia when I was asked to teach at USC for a term, and then was asked to become full-time. Now I run a design studio called Experimental, which sort of doesn't really categorize itself very well. We try and do narrative design across multiple different industry silos and in sort of research space, and then my lab is deeply engaged in research. Just put my timer on here, just so I don't get too out of control. So we're deeply interested in how you use storytelling to actually take control of the future. How can we pull from the power of storytelling, engage audiences in completely different ways, implement on that kind of future vision, use fiction very intently to kind of move what we know about the present into the future, and use that kind of capability of storytelling to engage a very large audience very deeply to create real change. So this is my kind of potted history of storytelling, missing out lots of important information, but primarily just kind of addressing the idea that storytelling existed for a very powerful reason. It existed in the at the beginning of humanity to make sense of the world around us. So when the tribe is gathering around the fire and there are, strange movements in the shadows or a silver disc goes across the sky, you create metaphors, the princess in the chariot, that evolves into a kind of collective storytelling which allows us to pass information down through generations. And very importantly, it was an aggregated storytelling space. So multiple storytellers around the fire, adding more and more information, more and more metaphors into that kind of collective knowledge, and then passing that down through generations. And then in 1440, the printing press sort of slams down in the middle of it. And for the past 600 years, we've been habituated with a completely different kind of storytelling, which is single author driven and kind of waiting to be told what to do. The writer who tells us, the film director who tells us, the designer who tells us, the starchitect, and all of those very interesting, deeply collaborative environments around place, around music, around dance, theatre, art, play, etc. Became more and more kind of siloed, more and more separate, more specialized, and turned into a very kind of regimented way of telling stories. And then the next kind of big sort of radical revolution we're right in the middle of is maybe loosely called immersive, where the notion that mixed reality, virtual reality, sort of taps back into some primal theatrical experience, something like Sleep No More, the Punch Drunk work, where you stand on the stage and wherever you look, you own a different part of the narrative. Wherever you stand on that stage, you actually start creating your own story as a collaborator in that story space. So it's kind of like the transition from classical music. I was talking with an amazing classical pianist, Lang Lang, a few months ago, and he said, why do I have to do what I'm told by somebody who's been dead for 200 years? He's really, how do you kind of transform the capability of the creative practice into something from symphony orchestra towards something closer to jazz, where every participant in that collaborative world space is bringing their own piece to the mix, and everybody influences that story space individually and with an equal kind of power in the space. So that's kind of very much driving my practice, I would say. World building and its ability to collect people around complex systems problems allows us to collect the sort of tribal knowledge and push it out into this kind of knowledge transfer space across multiple different media. So it moves from tribal storytelling into kind of a global narrative, I would suggest. So for me, this starts with Minority Report. Again, the accident of Minority Report was that I was hired on the same day as the screenwriter. So there was no script, and there was no script for about a year. So what we knew was very little. We had a kind of page of information from Steven Spielberg. We knew it was Washington, D.C. 2050, the year was 2050. We knew that at the core of the city was this idea of precogs, these precognitive beings who could predict murder and violent crime. And that Stephen wanted this to be an apparently benign world, so that when he pulls the rug out from under the audience and you begin to realize that loss of civil liberty it sort of outweighs the murder-free society attractor, that the audience would be already completely engaged with the idea that this was a real future. So the brief for us was, this is not science fiction, it's future reality. And that became very important because it gave us the key to go out into the world and do deep research. So we went into academic institutions, we went into industry, we went to laboratories, we were listening and talking to people like Apple, we were at MIT Media Lab, we were getting lots and lots of information about what is in the present. But the kind of umbrella of this was that with this experiment going in Washington, D.C., there was a massive influx of population, a huge vertical city springs up outside the constraints of old D.C., where you can't build higher than the Capitol building, and a vertical city arises, which is an entire kind of urban planning, and from that, narrative evolves. So we were realizing, having come through after the film had released, I sort of stood back and went, oh, hold on a minute, some things changed here. Storytelling was now a central, was being driven by how do we make sense of the world around us. Before we had a script telling us what to do. The world space allowed us actually to develop multiple different narratives, and even though there was a single linear narrative outcome, we knew that there were many possible stories that could have been told. And we had to introduce all sorts of new systems just to engage with this very, very different sort of circle of collaborators out in the real world. At the center of this was this kind of question, what if, why not? So what was driving our research was, why can't it be like that? And then talking to researchers, talking to these different spaces about the possibilities. And so now you kind of, you can Google on, Minority Report, how did Minority Report change the future? And sometimes there are up to 16 million hits on that because there were multiple different kind of things that Minority Report revealed that hadn't really been considered before. So we were looking at, Internet of Things, voice recognition, gesture interface, the idea of targeted advertising, autonomous vehicles, lots of different components. It wasn't that we were being so clever. We were just given access to people who were doing that work on the whole 15 years out. We were listening carefully to them. We were seeing what they were saying about things like a little 2-inch square of plastic that had ink being electronically, pushed to the top or bottom of a bubble that became the Kindle. And we were saying, well, what if that was a flexible substrate that could be wrapped around a car and the car could become invisible by transmitting the image from the other side? Or we were working with this young researcher at MIT who was doing gesture recognition. That kind of became the detection component of the film for Tom Cruise. He joined the art department as our in-house researcher and scientist. He was asked a year or two later whether he could build it for real. He just got a $65 million injection into his startup. There's about 200 people working. His system called Mezzanine is in Fortune 500 companies all over the world. And so we saw there was a real translation from design fiction, from that idea of fiction strongly intersecting present reality, and real change in the world. So as a process, we're doing this, that world building is kind of a combination of what I would call horizontal and vertical. You do initially the deep research around everything, all of the components of the world. You build holistic knowledge of the world. And in the way that, that this lays out, you start with urban planning and you ask the question, how does Tom Cruise get to work in the morning? Thomas Anderson, his character. And we just said, well, if he lives at the top of a very vertical building and he goes to work in old DC, what if a car was a combination of an elevator and a taxi cab, or lift and a taxi? What would that do to the vehicle? And we kind of, by default, came up with an autonomous vehicle, a piece of furniture that parks in your living room that goes vertically down the side of a building and then horizontally. That changed the form of the vehicle itself. It also changed our process. So we started at the very beginning of pre-production. We were essentially designing all the way through this one example. For example, this component, this car, went through rapid prototyping for approvals. That same data went into the illustration. The same data went into CNC for large-scale manufacture of the actual prop. It went into all of the R&D, the design visualization, and then it pushed out into previs, where Steven Spielberg was actually directing the sequence. So as well as it helping the design of the world deeply, I'd argue that this particular sequence and many others in the film could not have existed without building the world first. And so the story is coming directly out of the fabric of the world. Steven directed this piece of previs. You can see the film follows it exactly. It's flipping the kind of manufacturing process, the very kind of industrialized Victorian process that film largely still is, on its head. It also, we started off in an analog world space. We had painters painting with acrylic on board. By the time we finished, we were the first all-digital art department, and we had to pull from architecture and from various industries just to have the capability to properly imagine the future. What we also saw, as I mentioned earlier, is that multiple different stories could evolve out of this world. So once you've created the world, you can actually use completely different lenses in it. In this case, we were looking at, urban planning, you could say, or looking at the future of the consumer in the mall space. You could look at the future of technology. You could look at the future of mobility. So all of those things become this kind of interlocking system using world building at its base. And then extracting from that, whatever lens you apply is the information that you get out. And your world gets richer the more questions you ask of it. So I won't go deeply into this, but this is kind of the underlying practice that we use now, which uses the metaphor of a city. So if you imagine the conditions around a city might be weather or economics or the particular political climate, has a large scale kind of overall effect on the city. And then the city itself functions with a finely balanced relationship between energy, politics, infrastructure, and culture. And as you zero in on your kind of target through the neighborhood, through the family or the group that you're looking at, down to the individual at the center, and you can do this hundreds of times with different sort of focuses, you start to form a very close relationship through scale, from the human in the center to the city at the outside and everything in between, through time and through space. So you have this delicate relationship between people in space, and then you can start applying future to that. And you start just asking deeper and deeper questions. So once you have this kind of horizontal slice through the world, looking at those kind of primary areas of interest, and those are all areas that we can change, but we've used these over and over again. They seem to be capable of applying themselves to multiple different kind of world questions, world problems, kind of world cultures. You ask that kind of what if, why not question in different areas of interest, in different domains or different sectors, and you start getting answers back. So if you were looking at healthcare, for example, there's a direct relationship between healthcare at a government level, healthcare at a local city level, healthcare at the hospital and the kind of infrastructure of a hospital itself, and the patient. The patient asserts an influence on the hospital asserts an influence on the healthcare system, and vice versa. And that tension is kind of, in our terms, that's narrative. That's where story comes from. But if you can see a way to tell a new story about the way a patient can behave inside that kind of hospital infrastructure, you can start seeing how that can have an effect in the real world. This is a project I did with my students over a couple of semesters. We tend to start these world builds with some both provocations. So the provocation here came from the director Shekhar Kapoor, who was asking the question of a film in India: what if there was an economic collapse in 2019 and water becomes the new economic base? So a world where water is privatized. Makoko is a tiny fishing village in Lagos. It's extremely poor, but it's sitting on water. It's a floating village. And so we imagined, looking 20 years out with my class, what if the students who'd been taught in this real floating school that was built by Kunle Adeyemi in 2014 and changed actually the world's attention on this impoverished part of Lagos, what if those students each had developed their own kind of narrative and had evolved that through their kind of neighborhood? And what would that start to tell us, not only about how the neighborhood develops, but how does story work at all? So the students, first of all, gathered around the world, which is generally the practice, which is get the experts around the world, and they're very diverse. We had economists and urban planners and animators and dancers and writers, very, very diverse group. And then from that world that they created, they extracted individual narratives. Those narratives became a cluster of possibilities of stories inside this tight space. So we imagined a single day, a day in the life of each of these characters, and mapped where they might go in the world. But you can see this is one day with 6 characters. It becomes very complex very quickly. So we are now starting to look at how you can use these new technologies like virtual reality, not as an outcome, but as an actual tool of inception. So in this case, this is a way of storyboarding multiple different stories simultaneously. You're following those different tracks in the bottom right there. And you get to choose which of the characters you want to follow. And again, this is very, very early stages, storyboarding, very beginning of production. And this is as far as the class went. But we're looking at the notion of having agency in the world and actually forming a new kind of alliance where artists are working with coders, with programmers. So it's an art-science collaboration just to be able to actually sort of build these new tools from the ground up, which is what we were doing. So in that VR space, or in that mixed reality space, we have an opportunity that I think has been completely missed by the industry of looking at how these new capabilities, these new platforms radically change process itself. So it's not just like how quickly can you get your VR headset to market, but how do you actually create new content for it at all? Because VR is not in itself very interesting to me. I think VR is an extremely dystopian outcome, right? Everyone on their box with a box on their heads, completely isolated from each other. But it's a great provocation. It's a great way of saying, well, I'm going to be immersed in the world completely, and I'm going to be able to create a new narrative. I've just been working on Star Wars Episode 9, and we started looking at the very front end of that, and what happens if you take a director location scouting inside a model that you built that morning, where he puts on a headset and he's now location scouting with characters and a camera in that space within a few hours of it being created. He's already making the movie in the medium that is familiar to him, even though he won't do the final outcome of that for a year, probably, or a year and a half. So this is a project, again, we did at the school. It's 1895, and you're aboard a giant flying whale, as you would be in 1895. This is taken from young adult story by a writer, Scott Westerfeld. And we took the front end, we sort of did the pre-narrative of the books that he wrote that were set in World War I. And we imagined that this whale that was evolved out of sort of Darwin's theories into mixing DNA and creating new kind of fabricated creatures, is on its way from the Royal Society in London to Russia to deliver a gift of a fabricated animal to the Tsar of Russia. This entire fabricated world allows us to have a closed system, a laboratory essentially, to investigate deep kinds of immersive experience without ever having to model the world or create buildings or model a lot of different people. We were in a kind of fairly small closed system, a microcosm, that allowed us to explore deeply VR. This is a project we did in association partnership with Intel, who funded it for about 4 years. And Intel's interest was, how do we challenge our chips? All they wanted to know was, how difficult can you make this for us? Because if it's impossible, they love it. It's like, okay, we've really got some work to be done. So we really got we got a lot of support to have some crazy kind of ideas in here. So the first thing we did, and I should just say that part of the teaching practice now in my lab and in my class is to say to students that we are training them to design, to write, and to work for media that does not yet exist. Because the process, the platforms are changing so quickly that we know that AR is going to be huge in the future, but we have no idea what happens when, you know, the next person comes along and asks a specific question of augmented reality or a specific question of virtual reality, which creates a completely new platform. So we have to be incredibly adept now in the sort of breadth of media space.
Tonight, I don't want you to merely imagine a blind whale. I want you to experience it. Sight, sound, all of it.
So we built this for the Computer Electronics Show in 2014. It was the Intel CEO's first keynote, his first public appearance. And we just asked the question, what if you could transcend the screen space? So we flew an 80-foot whale over 5,000 people, no devices in the crowd except that one tablet that you saw, multiple cameras in real time recording the real presence of that whale at that moment in time over the 5,000 people. And even though they weren't seeing it directly above them, they were seeing themselves and the whale on the screen. It was the best reaction we've ever had from an audience who were being exposed to genuine augmented reality in real time. So the screen starts to disappear. And we moved from augmented reality investigation into kind of a virtual reality investigation using the same model. So in this case, you are invited aboard this floating laboratory that's hanging underneath the 1,000-foot whale. This was a project we did at Sundance. So you'll see there's some physical artifacts, and there's a virtual experience. You put the headset on, you're seeing a kind of Victorian laboratory. But when you reach out for a virtual object, you actually intersect a physical object that's aligned with it. So when you reach out, you realize that you're touching something, that it has real weight. And it not only has weight, but it has cause and effect. So you move it and something changes in the world. You're being asked to fabricate or to choose of 4 different creatures which one you want to fabricate. After you fabricate it, it comes out of the oven and you realize you can interact with it. You have a live interaction, it moves around, it knows where you are in space, you know where it is. And then at some point, it decides that it wants to see what it's like to be in your body. And you transfer, and at this point where it goes green, you realize you can fly, you've become this fabricated creature, and by doing a small gesture with your hands, you fly up through the space and you look back down at yourself on the ground. So we'd taken the audience, including Robert Redford, through being on a rail, being on kind of conventional 360, to interacting with the virtual space, to interacting with physical objects in the virtual space with haptics, to interacting with a virtual object that knew where you were, to becoming a virtual object and leaving your own body in 5 minutes. So that was the kind of outcome of the research, was like, what can you do with this VR and how far can you push it? And how much more computation do we need to actually make it work well? This is a project we did for a Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I'll just let Greg Lynn, who was the architect partner in this project, talk about it. But basically, it imagines where would social media take us if it allowed us to tap into a single city, a massive city, and interact with each other in completely different ways.
Our understanding of space is always changing. We once thought the world was flat because we knew the world was flat. All kinds of discoveries gave the world shape and depth. The way we conceptualize the world as a sphere changed the way we thought about space and distance. Our understanding of space is changing again. Online social networking has had a huge impact on the way we communicate now. And this is really just the beginning and only scratches the surface of the way we're going to interact with each other, communicate, and experience the world. We decided to think of New City as the entire world. So the world is, for the first time, becoming one connected city with 8 billion addresses, all located in a single virtual destination. It wasn't just about information design and geography, it was about how you experience this world. Rethinking what the space of this city would be, we obviously didn't want to work with a flat map. We also didn't want to work with an Earth or a globe. So we rethought New City as a series of manifolds. What we mean when we say manifolds are reconfigurable pieces of geometry that can distort, fold through themselves, and connect in ways that you couldn't connect with a plane or a sheet or a globe. We decided to take each of the continents on the Earth and make each continent one of these manifolds and let these things move and ebb and flow with different kinds of communication and information.
So this, that world is sort of massive world space where continents can shift against each other, and these chance interactions between New York and New Delhi, for example, will create new cultural possibilities. When that was developed in 2008, it was early to imagine how you could physically do that, but I think we're getting close to the possibility. This is a project we did. I run a conference for 7 years called The Science of Fiction. This was the last one we did in 2014. And here we imagined a provocation that said, what if you combined the DNA of Rio de Janeiro and Los Angeles and placed that combined DNA on a small island in the Pacific that was too small for its population. That one provocation ended up engaging 9 different schools in 7 different countries. We wrote about 1,500 narratives that came out of it. 1,000 of them were written in a single day by 300 people. And so we were really deeply testing the possibility of massive collaboration and massive collaboration distributed over distance. So it ran for about 1.5 years, and then we created a virtual museum to ingest all of the artifacts and the stories that were gathered together, which is still up on the web. Going from like the massive scale of New City, the project I'm working on right now with a school, a division at the USC of molecular biology called The Bridge. An amazing doctor, scientist in molecular biology called Ray Stevens has been developing medicine within his world space, but he felt that cellular biology had kind of hit a wall 20 years ago because it's such an esoteric language inside that space that only cellular biologists can only talk to other cellular biologists. And nothing had moved forward. They get deeper, better resolution, but they don't know more about the human body. And so the challenge here was how to use narrative to open up new metaphors and new language inside cellular biology and create a world space where multiple different scientists, indeed multiple different disciplines of all sorts, could gather together inside this world. So the project is still in process. We're at the end of our first year of funded research, and we're building this world, but using the city as a metaphor for the cells. So what happens if you map a complex system of a city to a cell? Could you find the metaphors for things that are really only understood by biologists and open them up for other people? So I'll just zip through some of the things we're doing. Looking at the world space, developing a language, changing the multiple interactions and massive complexity of a single cell into a series of neighborhoods. So we've got these 3 neighborhoods we've created with CETO as the nucleus in the center. And then each of the components that are being developed as characters in this world, or as architecture, or as infrastructure, or as transportation, messaging. And we're using analog in the real world, we're using architecture, but we're also using origami, for example, as a metaphor. It's a very appropriate metaphor for DNA, for the DNA of cells and the folded structures inside cells. So we were able to get this. The biggest complexity of this is actually getting a group of biologists and a group of artists to be able to talk at all. It took about 8 months to find common language across that space. But now we are all kind of talking some weird hybrid visual language and creating, well, little creatures now which are going to start populating a VR space that will go to Sunset. It's going to Shanghai for a big molecular biology gathering in about a month. But this world is one that you can inhabit, but it's deeply based in real biological fact. But a 9-year-old should be able to go here and be completely entranced by the fact that they are in a magical world at a scale that nobody can yet see. And scale is an incredibly interesting piece of this. The range of scale goes from something the size of a mountain to something the size of a very, very small, this CAMP, which is about the size of your hand. And we're trying to populate or enter that world with this huge scale difference. So lots of challenges in here of how you even navigate. And then how do you map that back to the city? Because equally interesting to the urban planners is how can you look at biological and organic systems as a new way of thinking about cities, and we're deeply interested in that. So we have partners on the urban and the city side, and we have partners on the biological and medical side working together, and both equally interested at two completely different parts of the scale that are actually informing each other. So as one example of the other end of the scale, we're working with Ford at the moment. This is a kind of analog VR experience we built for them 6 weeks ago in San Francisco, which gathered 600 people, about 200 different companies around, looking at the city of tomorrow. And you can see that kind of Jane Jacobs is actually kind of mapping directly to the notion of the organic and the possibilities of the organic in the city space. I will zip through this. So this is a project we did. I have to press a button here. Looking at the possibilities of looking at multiple different people inside a city over time. So this is developing a character called Sarah through her 9-year-old, 14-year-old, 19-year-old, 24-year-old self, and then seeing how stories could evolve based on where she interacts with her environment. So we built this as an interactive web experience that allows you to look at any individual bit of research and see where it takes you. And each of the places it takes you becomes a provocation for narrative. So writers, researchers do this work. All of that information gets ingested, it gets distributed around the world space according to whether it's dealing with energy, politics, infrastructure, or culture. And then a writer can go in and choose the part of it that they're interested in, and then the characters develop from that. So if I get this right, yes, okay. So what we've got is basically an engine, a research engine, which ingests a huge amount of data. We place the human at the center of that. The human creates is the core of kind of a bunch of story nodes. Those story nodes distribute through time and space, through who the character in the center interacts with and how they engage with their environment. And then those stories, every story node, which is in this tension between the space itself, the environment, and the needs of the character, becomes, as it says, so a prototype that has the potential to provoke itself into existence and to create change. And that's really the core of what I think this research and where world building is taking us. So thank you very much, and I think we're going to have a little chat.
A little chat, yeah.
If we have some time. Sorry, I've probably run on a bit long. Thank you. I'll just press that button.
Just intrude on your coffee break. I believe it's a fantastic opportunity to be here with Alex, both as not just for this program, I have to say, but for what we might be thinking of doing, next as well. So I think, Alex, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, really. Because, you know, the way that you've talked about world space, you know, as content, as visualization, as research, the way that, you know, we all talk about how difficult it is to bring disciplines together. You just don't seem to care, really. You just bring
Yeah, we don't care at all.
But you're at the same time developing a language and addressing those questions of disciplinary languages as well. So that's, you know, so it's really, really inspiring. I want to be much more mundane, if I can. So the first thing is about, you've worked at, you know, film industry, you're working with automotive, you're working with science. Which of those disciplines is the most able to embrace this, and which ones are the most conservative?
Well, interestingly, I would say. I mean, we're having some amazing dialogues in industry, and I've been working with Boeing and Nike and Ford, but some very traditional GM, some really, you know, old 100-year-old industries, who understand what's changing, and they're really ready to embrace change. I've also worked for 30 years in the film industry, and the most conservative of all the industries I've worked with is the film industry. They are so sure that they've got it that it's actually incredibly difficult to create change in that industry. And it's partly because it's incredibly volatile and there's a huge amount of risk every time you make a new movie, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a natural kind of conservatism. But I think we are getting very out of alignment with the possibilities. If you fold together interactive, immersive, storytelling in a cinematic sense, animation, theater, architecture, all of these actually use basically the same language, and they're all deeply engaged in the notion of people in space in relation to their narratives and the way their narratives play out. And so I guess our mission is to kind of break down that and be able to traverse all of these different spaces freely.
So I think one of the aspects that I'm really interested in, I'm sure lots of people in the room are really interested in, is then the issue of talent development. So how do we develop talent to be able to tell their stories, whether it's from the research, whether this is talent coming from the research sector or coming from the creative sector. At the start of your talk, you mapped out, there was a point where the film industry benefited hugely from the kind of training slopes that were the pop promo business. I mean, I remember that period. Lots of great directors came out of that. What do you think the equivalent would be now? That if we're thinking about not just putting together research partnerships, but moving that into experimental content, what's the equivalent? What could we do?
Well, music videos were an incredible breeding ground for talent. And I think it's because that they were individually not only pretty low risk, but they did have an immediate sort of feedback loop, right? So I remember amazing music videos, we were doing 3 a week. We would start on Monday, you'd shoot on Wednesday, it would release on Friday to MTV. If it was a hit on Saturday, then we'd have work again on Monday, So the loop is really rapid. And I think what's desperately missing in, for example, in VR, that nobody really knows how to monetize yet, is the opportunity to do kind of shorts in VR, to really sort of get behind the idea of AR, VR, new media, mixed reality, and look at small microcosm kind of projects where you can get a lot of creative people gathered around it. They're going to make discoveries literally on a weekly basis, and there's not a huge amount of risk. Instead of the idea of like, how soon can you get the headset to market, and then like, oh, wait a minute, what are we going to do? There's no content, which is kind of where we are at the moment. Okay,
so that's an interesting one. If there's anybody funding short film programs in the room, then I think that's a really interesting one. I mean, for all of those people thinking of talent development programs into traditional media, I guess your message is this is future media. We should be working with those.
I think so, and it's also, I think, folding it together. I mean, we were talking about theatre and Punch Drunk, for example. I mean, there's incredibly progressive work going on in music, in theatre, in mixed media. Film's not going to go away. Film's an incredible medium. It's not about undermining the film industry, or TV is exploding. It's really, really interesting what's happening in TV now. It's just, I think one has to be open. The way we think about story is develop the world, develop the narratives, and then work out which is the right medium for them. Not like I'm going to fund a movie, like fund an idea and then let it become what it needs to become. And half the time it's going to drive the medium itself to places it didn't think it was going to go.
Okay, that's I think that's a really deep message for this program about how people might want to think about articulating their partnerships is, build the idea and then work out the application.
Yeah.
I just got one last question, really. If you had one piece of advice for us of what we should be trying to develop out of this program, and we're very determined that it has to come from below, it has to come from each of these partnerships, what would your piece of advice be for us, and what would your piece of advice be for the teams that are going to come together?
Yeah, it's a big question. I was having a conversation we just ran a program with the Sundance Institute for around world building, their first program of putting fellows inside a world building program. And the Kauffman Institute was involved, who are particularly engaged in developing entrepreneurs and startups and localization in the US. And what we talked about, and I think it probably is the core of this, is that along with collaboration goes the removal of conservatism, in that if you're not open-minded when you put all of that sort of interdisciplinary group together and let them go where they go, you're going to kind of force it to stay in old channels. And I think the Buckminster Fuller quote is essential, which is that you only create change by letting go of what comes before. And so I think what we decided is you need this period where throwing things at the wall, like blue sky, all of those kind of cliche metaphors of free thinking, is that allow that interdisciplinary group to drive itself to completely crazy places. Because even if you end up with ideas that are all the way out here and they're never going to happen, this cluster of ideas are dragged magnetically towards them. And these ideas get more and more powerful because there's enough craziness in what's the Mad Lab? It's the madness that we need to allow to become a powerful component in this, I think.
Okay, well there's an interesting one, particularly for a research council, more mad. So I think,
crazy.
I think that is a challenge for us, actually. We want to encourage multidisciplinarity, but then we've got to, I guess, put our money where our mouth is and actually assess it, evaluate it, proposals on the basis that they can be that speculative. So I think that's been a fantastic provocation and kind of stimulus. Thanks to Michael Contaldo for telling us about the city, and to Alex McDowell. And after a good injection of coffee, we'll come back and do the briefing on the competition. Thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, welcome back. Thank you. I always used to say there was a educationist I used to work with a lot called Stephen Heppel, and rule number one in life is never follow Stephen Heppel. So I'm now going to revise that to never follow Alex McDowell. So I have one. I've got only one thing that I can hold your attention with, which is £51 million. So really doesn't. Hopefully my slides don't have to be quite so exciting and inspiring as Alex's. So okay, Creative Clusters Programme. So as you all know, the background to this is the government's industrial strategy, and not just the industrial strategy, which is looking for sector deal for the creative industries underway, but the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. So this is several £1 billion, I think 4.8 is the number that springs to mind, of new money directed towards essentially R&D in key sectors of the UK economy. So the battle that has been that we've gone on, or sorry, I'm supposed to say journey, aren't I? Not battle. The battle that we've been on for the last year, effectively, since the announcement of the Strategy Challenge Fund, is to make sure that the creative industries are regarded as an industrial sector in the context of R&D. So the first few announcements out of the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund may have indicated that at that stage we hadn't won that battle. So there's several initiatives around the automotive sector, including a big investment and the wonderfully named Faraday Challenge into future battery technology. There have been other initiatives announced into autonomous vehicles in dangerous environments, for which read, I think, the oil and gas sector. And there have also been significant investments in the healthcare sector, and specifically in the pharmaceutical sector in terms of improved drug research delivery. So what you might think of as the classic R&D intensive 20th century industries. But up until recently, nothing about the creative industries. So the battle's been to ensure that the creative industries are seen, just as they are now seen as a legitimate area of economic focus, So you don't get many people now in policy making who don't say the creative industries are important. You get very few people standing up there saying, oh, they're fluffy, they don't make stuff. But the translation of that into R&D, the need to invest in innovation in the creative industries, that argument isn't one on the same level. That has been our experience. Until a couple of weeks ago, when this programme got announced. Now, you may have noticed that you were invited or made aware of this event before its announcement. But the context of this really emphasises how this is seen in policy making. So Peter Bazalgette did his independent review of the creative industries. That launch was on the 22nd. So is that 3 weeks ago or two? It's 3 weeks ago, isn't it? And at that, Greg Clark announced this programme officially. So it's kind of like it's a standard experience for those working on government programmes, I think, that you wait for 4 months for a ministerial announcement and then you get 2 ministers at once and saying what a fantastic thing it is. So the context for this in policy is seen as this is part of the sector deal. And I think that Greg, as well as saying what a great thing this programme was, positioned it as a kind of down payment on the wider argument that Baz made for an investment, particularly in the creative industries and creative industries clusters. Now, I just want to say at the outset, take that with a pinch of salt. This is not a pilot for what Baz suggested. Baz has suggested a wide-ranging intervention across government in creative clusters. What this is a part of that. It's what can R&D, what impact can an increased investment in R&D within those clusters have? So just bear that in mind. So clusters. So we've become used, as I said, to the arguments, which have become a very coherent and common argument about the creative industries as the fastest growing sector of the economy, the fastest growing export sector of the economy is a really interesting part of that at the moment. And the Creative Industries Council's, snazzy graphics, have positioned that really cleverly, I think, now within this kind of place-based economics idea of, could this be particularly important? Can the creative industries be particularly important in rebalancing the economy and driving growth across the UK, because the creative industries, the benefits of the rapid growth of the creative industries have accrued largely in certain areas, and that's not just the southeast. It's places like Greater Manchester. So, what would be the vehicle for that investment? And I think we started this thinking that clusters are that vehicle. So you'll all be familiar with the various work that Nesta, that Hassan and Juan have done in revealing clusters through data. So it's not just, this is the Geography of Creativity report, which is Creative England and Nesta. I look back and it's 10 years since Nesta first produced a map of clusters. There were only 9 of them then. And it's always fun to provoke some audiences, not necessarily in the Northwest, but to show a map showing the 9 clusters, and you're not in one at the moment. It also goes down very well in Birmingham, as a lot of people have noticed. So it's not just the creative industries, but the tech and digital industries have also worked out the power of this clusters argument. So this is the map from the last Nesta report. There's a new report coming out, Creative Nation, sometime before Christmas, I think, with a new set of data updated. These are the 47 clusters that Nesta identified, and actually for a Northwestern audience, there's no need to throw fruit at me, because obviously the Northwest comes out very well in the Nesta data. Not just the two the conurbations of Merseyside and Greater Manchester, but also Cheshire. I was at a Weave event last night, they were advocating the case for creative businesses in both West and East Cheshire. Really interesting. Really interesting that it's a cluster that kind of lacks a core HEI. I don't know what you would make of that. They were asking what they should do. I said they should sell their businesses to core HEIs in this room. It's an idea. So just on the definitions, so what do we mean? Nesta's definition of clusters, I think we're all pretty comfortable with. So geographic concentration of creative businesses, but also workforce. That is key. It's not just businesses, it's workforce. And it's not just that they're in the same place, that they trade with each other, they compete with each other, they collaborate with each other, they're in supply chains with each other. So obviously clusters are more than just businesses. So for our purposes here, the key component that we want to use as the architect of this program is the higher education institutions. But it's not just universities. It's not just universities, there's cultural institutions in there, there's trade associations. The key alignment, I think, of regional and local policymakers, economic development agencies, as they would be in Scotland, or the LEPs, as they are in England, those bodies need to align with what this is doing. So what are the things that we're asking here is, whatever the questions on the form, one of the key things is your ability to convince us that you know your cluster, you know the businesses within it, and you're aligned with all the other key stakeholders, and you know what they're doing. The other thing that Nesta pointed out is clusters come in different sizes and configurations, but there are other things that in different clusters make them work. So I think the role of hubs, where co-working spaces, incubators, they're different in different clusters. Some have a superfluity of hubs and co-working spaces. I think Manchester doesn't lack those, and there are several more coming on stream, including the old bonded warehouse where I used to work when I was at Granada many, many years ago. But other clusters lack some of those things. So again, it's a question of knowing your cluster. In data terms, we've been working with the Nesta team and Juan particularly to try and unpick some of the geographical data. So as you know, Nesta did the map, the geography of creativity, analysed travel to work areas and came out with these clusters. And this is the overall data. So what we wanted to do was to release some more data for you as you're putting together your bids, and there's two reasons for that. So unpick the data at a subsectoral level and see if Birmingham does appear in the data, as we're always teasing them, and it does. So we've unpicked it by subsector and made it more, it's not more granular in geography, but it is, we'll release it as some maps, but also some data sheets. And having been doing these things for a couple of weeks and saying it will be soon, we will do this next week. So it'll be on our site next week. When you look at that, you'll see some sectors reflect the national picture. So film, audiovisual media looks pretty much like the overall UK economy for the creative industry. So red is hot, white is not. No, red is hot, blue is not. But you look at some other sectors, architecture, much more evenly spread across the UK. So that's interesting, isn't it? And much more different in different sectors. You look at craft, you get a completely different picture altogether. So in businesses, you get a more general UK picture. But in terms of employment, its employment impact, you start to see some very interesting things around the periphery of the UK. Museums, galleries and libraries, quite perhaps surprisingly when you unpick the data, the very strong southeast focus that you might expect rather disappears, particularly in employment. And there's something interesting going on there in Scotland, which for anybody who knows the Highlands is perhaps relatively easy to understand in terms of the role of the public sector in the Highlands of Scotland. What we're going to do, so we've pulled out some things starting looking at the north. So interesting where the top 10 cities and Manchester, Leeds and Merseyside start to then emerge in specific sectors, advertising and marketing being one of them. Music and performing visual arts, Manchester pops up as one of the top 10, as you'd expect. Again, so architecture. IT, software and computer services, suddenly Cheshire pops up there as a real hotspot. So there's an interesting thing that when we don't just look at the creative industries per se, we look at the subsectors, the clusters look in slightly different shapes. So what we want to do is release this data to you so you can play with it and put together your bids. The other reason to do it, which probably won't have escaped anybody, is so we have a measure of what you put in your bids and whether it bears any resemblance to the data. So if you were going to put forward that you have a world-class cluster or world-class businesses in a certain sector, we just wanted to have some kind of at least evidential yardstick to measure that against. Am I going backwards? No, okay. Right, so when Baz said in his wider kind of plea for £500 million of cluster investment across the board, he identified three reasons for doing it. Providing a stimulus to regional growth. I don't think anybody can disagree with that. I think, again, as Anthony said, this is funding from the industrial strategy. Part of the industrial strategy is about placemaking, and part of it's about rebalancing the economy in the terms of Whitehall, which means rebalancing regions versus the southeast. Improving productivity through increasing the density of businesses in the cluster. So that's more businesses in a cluster lead to rises in productivity because of the way they interact, or scaling businesses in the cluster. Again, it's a very admirable aim. It's the context for this call. It's not the objective or the method for this call. But the third point that Baz talked about really is. So developing a tailored talent and R&D pipeline for local areas, driven by closer collaboration between industry and education. So that puts this call, I think, that's where we do locate and dock into what Baz is talking about. So what's the programme? So that's the overall objective, growing the creative industries by driving growth through new R&D. And we're talking about products and service innovation. I'll come back to that in a moment. It was something that Anthony raised right at the start. We want to create a robust creative R&D infrastructure. That's our long-term aim. We'd like to have an R&D infrastructure for the creative industries that was considered in the same way as the medical research infrastructure is compared with healthcare. In fact, we've even suggested we might explain our role to the DCMS as think of us as your research council. Apparently they'd never thought about that before. So we've got £51 million of funding to do this, and the objective is 8 R&D partnerships, which is what we're talking about this morning, but also a Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre. So this is an independent research observatory for data on the creative industries. I won't talk about it more today. It's subject to a separate process. Some of you will have already become engaged in that. So what, the what question, primarily the what you're going to do comes from you, comes from the ground up, and we're just trying to give a flavour of what we think are the most important things. So as Anthony said, there's right at the start, there is a series of challenges faced by creative industries businesses, whether it's business models and IP, it's investment and access to finance, which I'm sure Dawn from Creative England will talk about later, skills shortages, ability to trade internationally, access global markets, which is also a question of collaboration and supply chains, and the equality and diversity issues that challenge particularly some of our sectors. But, having said that, so that's the context, we know that all those things are challenges facing businesses. We see kind of primus inter pares of these product and service innovation. So a more classical R&D definition. It's about creating, it's about R&D that will drive future growth through stuff. You can call that stuff content, you can call that stuff experiences, or you can call it products. But we do think there should be a focus here on looking at R&D about the stuff. Key aims. Okay, so this is where I get to repetitively hammer home some key messages to the point of boredom. This programme is about enhancing creative clusters. This is the first time we've got major R&D investment for the creative industries. We cannot afford to cock it up. So we've taken a decision that what this programme is about, the most likely way to get success is to enhance existing clusters, to invest in R&D in clusters where the relationships are already formed and where the businesses are strong. Because that's our best chance of proving the case and, frankly, making this a fixture in the R&D kind of infrastructure. So we're also interested in leveraging existing assets. So greenfield site clusters, clusters in development are not the focus of this programme at this time, although obviously important for the future. So we want HEI, creative industries and the cluster enablers to come together in partnership. So it's really, really important that that alignment is there, and that, as Anthony again said right at the start, that industry is involved at all levels of this, setting the challenges, governance, management, delivery. So what we're trying to do is the creative R&D partnerships so what we want is R&D programs, again, separately the Policy and Evidence Centre. So the R&D partnerships, I'm going to say it again, embedded within existing creative clusters, okay? I know that won't stop applications coming in from places that want to develop clusters, but you just can't say you weren't warned. So you've got so what does that mean? What's the focus? You've got to be able to identify challenges that businesses within that cluster face and construct these things as challenges. Now, this is fashionable, but it is also a good way to focus the mind on questions that can actually be answered. Each R&D partnership is hosted by a key HEI. What does that mean? Well, it could mean a lot of different things. What it mainly means is they fill in the form. But they must bring together and prove that they can bring together the other relevant partners to address that challenge. So whether that's industry, whether it's local or regional government, sector bodies, economic development, the investment community, whoever is applying for this is applying on behalf of the partnership, not implying on behalf for a research program for them to deliver entirely on their own through their research resources. So we want the program to be collaboratively designed and delivered. So this is, well, I'll return to this in a different way on another slide. We want it to be multidisciplinary, and I think that Alex's presentation is a kind of fantastic stimulus to that. So we want you to bring together the disciplines, the research disciplines, and the industrial actors that can solve the challenges that you've identified. We are the Arts and Humanities Research Council, but this is an industrial strategy challenge program project. And so if the challenge requires a particular mix of disciplines to solve it, so be it. There is no requirement to have a group of philosophers and historians deciding what is good for this. It's bringing together the disciplines that can bear on the problem. The creative industries, for me, are the arts and humanities part of this, rather than the research disciplines. We want it to be dynamic. We want a very clear challenge at the outset. So that's what you should be focusing on in your stage one bid, is identify the challenges, talk to us about the cluster. But we do anticipate it will change. So we'd also like to know how you will flex it going forward. But just saying we're going to flex it going forwards is not enough, because that will fail at the first hurdle. So identifying challenges. So again, so apologies, but not really, if this sounds repetitive. The challenge must be defined by the needs of the cluster of which the research partnership is a part. Okay, so if you've got a research community who are interested in a thing that actually happens somewhere else, probably not such a great solution. You really need to tightly bind the research community and the businesses in the cluster together. The challenge that you come up with must be recognised by industry. Now, I know from having been part of quite a few industry research collaborations and read many more applications as an assessor, that second bullet there is very easily said, but quite hard to deliver. So if you identify a challenge within, I don't know, within a cluster base in the northeast, and I couldn't take that to a business in the northeast in that sector that you've identified that challenge and say, is this a challenge that you'll face? And they go, don't know what you're talking about. That will be a fail. So it's got to be recognised by industry as a challenge. That could be a short-term challenge. Hopefully it could be a long-term challenge as well. This is not to say that we need this very, very pragmatic things, but they must be recognisable by industry. We would like, within that petal diagram, a due focus on R&D for new products, services and experiences. That's phrased relatively carefully. Due focus. So we don't want you to ignore it. The challenges must be addressable by the organisations in the partnership. So if you say you're going to address this through R&D, you must have people who can do that, whether they be industry people, whether they be research academics, whether they be independent research organisations, whatever. And it's got to be distinct and measurable. Now we can perhaps handle that in Q&A, what that means, and probably even more so in the session the team will run this afternoon. But the way to think about it is, it has to be able to lead to growth in the creative industries. Okay, getting towards the end there. So key points, what will you need? You'll need strategy and vision. So particularly in the stage 1 bid, so the characteristics and strengths of the cluster, the details of the partnership. What we mean by the details of the partnership is not only just who's involved, but what they're going to contribute. So every participant has to contribute. I think coming from outside, there's been lots of incentives for very wide-ranging, multi-partner academic collaborations. That may not be the answer in this case. So because of the needs to engage industry, to the industrial strategy challenge framework that you're going to have to deliver impact and results, these very wide-ranging partnerships may not be the answer. They may be the answer. You know, you work it out for yourselves, and the important point is to make the case. And make the case how the cluster will benefit from the partnership. So it's collaborative R&D, so we want to know what you want to do. Again, nice and clear, if you can at this stage, but with the understanding that that will flex and how you respond. The programme's about collaboration. So 2 things. We've talked about disciplines, in terms of research disciplines. It's interesting to think about how that collaboration works across sectors. So one of the decisions you'll all have to take is your partnership addressing a series of sectors, or is it going to focus on a sector? That's not for us to tell you. That comes out of the partners, it comes out of the reality on the ground. We're not trying to impose this from above. Somebody said to me last week, so you'll be wanting a games cluster, and you'll be wanting an immersive cluster, and you'll be wanting this. And I said, well, if it turns out like that, great. But no, that's not part of our design process. That is not something we're looking for. Leadership. Strong and shared leadership, that's always a tricky one. It's going to be key, and so is a governance structure. But the thing to remember that we really would like you to think about hard is, how does the leadership and governance structure reflect the industrial and HCI collaboration in this, right up to and including, as Anthony said, the question of whether the ideal director, and I say director rather than PI for emphasis, the ideal director for one of these partnerships, what their background should be. We don't think there's one answer, but we would like you to consider and argue why you take the route that you do. And then the last point, the application. Yes, a lead HEI is going to fill in the form, but they are applying on behalf of the partnership, and it's important that it reflects that. Key dates and milestones, you probably know all these. So we want expressions of interest in by the 27th. Expressions of interest, you must put one in if you're going to put a bid in subsequently. Don't oversweat it, I think. We've tried to make the expression of interest as lightweight as possible. One of the main objectives for us is to be able to talk to a community of people who are bidding, rather than shout out to the world through social media and hope someone's listening. So there's a kind of pragmatic element to it. It's also so that we can, the team at the AHRC can start to prepare the assessment and peer review process for this. Early stage applications, 7th of December. We're intending to turn them round by end of January, but we've put in early February. And then we'll go to a shortlist. And at that stage, we'll expect that to become a dialogue. I think. So this isn't a process where bids will go through unaffected. I think that we expect to get some fantastically strong bids, but there may be, within those that are all fundable, there may be the opportunity to engineer and have conversations, and also introduce some perhaps national partners in terms of national IROs or national or even global businesses into the process at that stage. And then the main thing is, and it's a crazy timescale in some way, is open for business by this time next year. And the reason for that is the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund has a time to die meter on it and an end point. And if we hadn't committed to this timescale, the medics would have spent all the money before we got our act together. Final thought. When I came in and just started to discuss with Andrew Thompson the general approach around the creative economy and also then the cluster bid that Anthony and Andrew and others had driven through, we started talking about different kinds of research that we might be trying to encourage. So research about the creative economy, it's kind of fairly obvious. We know it when we recognise it. We are, through the PEC, trying to enhance that, improve both the quality and the scope. Research with the creative economy, so that's what the KE hubs did, par excellence. They did a great job of developing new ways of working between creative businesses and researchers, particularly using co-production methods. And then there was research for the creative economy. So I admit, so my only research training is as a scientist. And that role that, particularly neuroscientists, that role that team-based research driving new knowledge further forward into the impact in healthcare seems to me an obvious one. So I was trying to think of, and then the time I spent as a business, is where did I go for research that was going to show me ways of delivering future value, new concepts, new content, new experiences in my business. And actually, I just don't think we do enough of it. I just don't think we do enough research for the creative economy. So if this program's about anything, it's probably the R&D partnerships are not about research about the creative economy. That's through other parts of this program and other programs. We think they will involve research with the creative economy. Of course, we're encouraging collaborations with business. But collaboration in itself and new ways of working, and particularly new ways of working that deliver research outputs but not much for the business, are not the focus of this program. What this is about is getting some decent money into research for the creative economy. So that's where I'm going to leave the briefing. There's a technical session this afternoon, and we're going to take some questions. And I'm going to be joined by, because I need minders from the AHRC, because I'm not really an academic. So Dylan and Alex, making her debut as SRO for this programme, are going to join me, and we'll take some questions from you. And of course, between us, we should be able to handle some of them, because we've had some of these questions before. So hopefully that got you going. It's a crowd in Manchester, so I expect kind of a degree of challenge from that. Who wants to start? They're stunned. Right, okay, thank you very much. We've got mics coming round, so if you could say who you are, where you're from, that would be helpful.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the presentations. My name is Magda Sibli. I'm from Sheffield University School of Architecture. I would like to ask about where spin-out companies and patents from universities fall in this call. If you have developed a design, for example, that has been protected and there is possibility of working with a number of creative industries locally to launch that innovative product, is this something that would be looked at as interesting for this bid, for this
So this would be a design that's reached a kind of patent or protected design stage developed from within the university?
Yes, and has external collaborators from the industry.
That's an interesting and completely new question, actually.
Right.
So I'm trying to think.
Thank you.
It's an interesting one because in some ways that's a kind of spin-out knowledge, kind of more conventional, I would take that as a kind of more conventional knowledge transfer approach. So from my side, which is the kind of creative side, I wouldn't rule it out at all, but I think the question is that a component, is that a major focus of what might become quite a big partnership, or is it an individual project, would be my feel.
Yeah, and I think the same. I mean, it depends on that individual case. Is it a component? Is it answering, if you take the challenge-based approach, is it actually going to solve that challenge in a different way and actually create that growth that you can measure? So yeah, if it's a component, I wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah, Marion.
Hi, my name is Marion. Also, I'm from University of York. Inspired by Alex's presentation, the ambition and the challenges could be quite aggressive or ambitious, and they
Sounding
could,
good so far.
Okay, but they could also be regarded kind of in the near future, and the near future agenda might deliver more visible and more significant immediate returns. The long-term vision might be a bit more risky. I'm not quite sure how, and I know you might bounce that question back to me, but that's a tension I have in my reading of the call.
Yeah, I don't. I don't think you're wrong to spot that as a tension. I think that the objectives here are within the lifetime of the programme, measurable impacts on growth. R&D itself can be one of those impacts because a greater R&D component, I would say, within a cluster, you can measure that, and you can measure the kind of concentration of that, I would say. We're not quite in the world of ERDF in terms of jobs protected and jobs created. But we will be challenged by those kind of metrics. What we want to do is work with the cohort to develop the right metrics, but we may also have to compare them with the traditional metrics. So there is an emphasis. I took a slightly different message from Alex's work, actually, which was, it looks very speculative and far in the future, but actually it's very intimately engaged with industry. So if you're involved in industry R&D partnerships, some of those will have short-term deliverables and some of them will have long-term impacts. So I think there's a tension, but you'll know as you develop your own how you can play that out. And I think a sole emphasis on long-term speculative things, speculative impacts will probably not be perfect, but I think looking at both would be a very good idea. Sorry, I've waffled.
Yeah. Well, I think we're putting in some specific support around the impacts in evaluation and monitoring of the programme as well. So again, as Andrew said, we're going to look to design that with the people who are actually funded as well. So I mean, we will get some sort of help and guidance and advice on the way you frame that and the way that you can potentially put that into a kind of long-term benefits realisation type of activity.
Excellent suggestion.
Yeah, sorry, let's go next door and we'll work our way back towards, I can see, yes.
Thank you. I'm Rob Aitken, I'm from York St John University. Third question from east of the Pennines. The issue of impact, clearly the Nesta reports identifies areas of intensity and areas of growth. 50 jobs in rural North Yorkshire makes a big local impact, but 50 jobs in Manchester or Leeds is a spit in the ocean. So to what extent will local impact be factored into the way in which these applications are evaluated, bearing in mind the local context rather than necessarily the national context?
Okay, so can I do one, and then I'll pass to you for the impact measurement, I think. So I think on the local thing, I think, again, I would go back to, I think, what we're trying to do is make an investment in R&D, industry research, R&D collaborations in existing creative clusters. So we're locating these not across the country, but we're locating them where there is already significant momentum. So I think that's one of the things that will affect that. And then perhaps Alex and Dylan.
Yeah, my microphone obviously wasn't working, so I've now got this to talk into. So I think you're right to highlight the different scale of impact, but impact is one of those tricky things. And again, going back to this challenge focus, what are you doing what are you solving? So yes, there will be metrics there, and yes, we really hope that you're going to create the jobs and the growth, but what have you solved? What have you created? And also, when you're looking at impact and drawing on my previous experience with other research councils, sometimes it's not just about that impact in the local area. So it's about the impact on the creative industries for the UK and the UK economy. So don't rule that out as well.
Yeah, I'd say that.
I think there's another thing about, why we want this kind of dialogue, and it may be something that the Policy and Evidence Centre takes up, is also jobs, the idea of jobs and the creative industries is not an idea, it's not a simple issue. There's a lot of, we've got a large freelance workforce which often get missed out of those kind of metrics. We've got lots of people who work across different, they don't have a job, they work for several different organisations. So we've got to think about how we do that, because we're not building factories. Yeah, we'll go to Rachel at the back, and then we'll come down the front, and then this side of the room. Come on. Right. Okay, Martin. Thank you.
I was just going to ask. Obviously, I led one of the knowledge exchange hubs, and I would say, from the experience of doing that, I mean, I'd never been measured as much in my life as an academic. I mean, the reports that I had to put into the AHRC, the things we had to measure. I think at the beginning we were naive about it. So I think actually there is going to be quite a lot of key performance indicators, and will it be that those indicators start to be not only in the bid but actually co-created through the programme? And some of them will be emergent depending on the policy environment it's in.
Well, I think with this programme in particular, we've got an enormous delivery plan on how we're actually going to deliver this programme and how we're going to look at things like KPIs and how you actually manage to work out what these things are actually doing. And I think the difference with this programme versus other things we've funded is we're going to be far more upfront about managing your expectations about what that is going to look like. So we're already working through how we see that kind of stuff working in the programme, and we will work with you on it. But so it's not going to be one of the. And I know with the hubs you probably had an email on Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock saying, "Oh, can you just give us a load of evidence about what you're doing?" And it needs to be at 9 o'clock on Monday. Still, quite. So I think we're going to try and manage our way around that to ensure that you actually have your information and that you might need to respond to that in a kind of form that you can actually give us on a sort of fairly regular basis.
However, we're not going to rule out those 4:30 on a Friday evening things that have to be in at 9 o'clock in the morning. I cannot emphasise enough, I was cross-council lead for the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. I was running in and out of Treasury and Bays, making sure that the Research Council's got a good chunk of this money. And Anthony and Andrew have said this is different money. We talk about it coming with strings. I actually think of that as big bits of rope. They are very thick, things that we need to deliver, and we cannot muck it up. So yes, you are going to be measured. This money does need to have an impact. It really does need to do what we're saying here. And, that might be a bit different. But actually, isn't it exciting too?
Okay, I think I had a question down the front. Oh, okay.
I wanted to ask a question on the challenge of Brexit, particularly the impact of internationalism on this programme, and the way in which internationalising in non-European areas will be also something that's taken into consideration when talking about not just the regional, but the way the regional impacts with the rest of the world after Brexit.
So, interestingly, this was one of the things that we struggled with or thought about quite a lot when we were designing the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund. At the end of the day, this is about UK economic growth. It is a UK industrial strategy. Having said that, government policy is the UK is open for business. Therefore, actually, collaboration to get the best expertise can be multinational, and we would encourage that, but do think about the fact that this is about UK economic growth, and this is the UK industrial strategy.
I'm going to come to the front because this lady's been waiting for a while. Oh, okay, you sure?
I think my question was, what if the challenge and problem solving is applicable further than the borders of the UK? However, if you do take examples from the UK to use for your research project, would that be something that is positive?
So I think.
Or it only focuses on the UK?
So I think again, challenge-led. We're going to be looking at what the challenges are for the UK creative industry and what's going to create UK economic growth. However, if there are spillover effects and if you can use best practice from other countries, that is, that's all fair game.
Or the result of the research is applicable in other countries. Will that be?
No, there are likely, we know what the research process is like. There are likely to be other applications elsewhere as well.
I think another way to look at that might be to think about the creative business partners in those and their access to global supply chains or distribution. So actually export becomes part of internationalisation. that's different from research internationalisation, but perhaps, you know, kind of really important. Let's go over there. We'll go, yeah, Martin in the back and then in front.
Martin Evans, Manchester Metropolitan. I'm going to try and bring together two things, and it's around the nature of the HEI consortia and the relationship to the geographical region. So, Andrew, you said that you are unsure whether a multi-HEI approach is or isn't appropriate. So, but I think you were erring on the side of it being less appropriate, but you can clarify that in a moment. But I was interested in the FAQs on the AHRC website. So I'm not sure who answered them, but I'm just going to read out that, can there be more than one proposal from the same geographical region? The answer is yes, but the end of that sentence says, it is unlikely that we will be able to make multiple awards from the same region. So in one way, a message is you're saying that you don't necessarily want the regions' HEIs to work together. And then in another message, you're saying, but we're only going to fund one in each region. So your thoughts would be welcome.
I don't think it's saying one. I think it's saying we're not going to fund 8 awards all based in London, for example.
Microphone.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I think there's a possibility we could end up funding 2 that are in the same region, but I think we don't want to spend the whole fund focusing on one city or geographic region, because I don't think that would do what the programme is intended to do. But in terms of the way the partnerships are made up, they need the roles of each of those institutions in that partnership need to be specifically put in place to enable the challenge to be answered that is relevant to that cluster. So I guess the point is that we don't want to just see every university that sits within a region on a bid just because they sit within that region.
Yeah, I think I don't think that there's that much of a conflict. I think we don't want to be prescriptive. We want, you know, what these partnerships are aiming to do and what their focus is has to come from the clusters. So I think one of the dimensions for me is, where's the cluster? So, you know, in some regions, HEIs are more distributed across the UK than powerful creative industries clusters, for instance. So I think there's a kind of onus to think about that and what that means. I think one of the other things is when we did an event in the North East, which also included a lot of Yorkshire institutions, Kerb Kim, who many people here might know because he's working in Liverpool, did a keynote, and I asked him, did the chat afterwards, and asked him what was the one piece of advice. And he said the one piece of advice is not to have so many universities collaborating at the top that all the money sticks to the sides before it gets to the businesses. So I think that's from an industrial perspective, makes a lot of sense.
Just a question about, so Ace Kalo from MadLab. Question about the challenge.
Yeah.
So are you looking for a laser-like focus on a single challenge, or would you also be interested in where you have a number of complementary challenges that could be drawn together in one narrative, but nonetheless
I think that's a really good question, actually, and I am going to bounce that back to you. Is you tell us. So, you know, it makes me think of Time Bandits. You know, day one, lasers. I think that we do want focus. I think one of the questions you've got to ask yourself is, as a partnership, is particularly perhaps in a metro region where there are a number of creative industry sectors represented, is, should the proposition focus on the needs of one or a subgroup of those because they've got common challenges, or should it try and meet the needs of the cluster industries as a whole? We know we want propositions that are addressable by R&D. Not all challenges are addressable by R&D. They just exist and may be addressed by other things. So I think it is that design piece about what the partnership should focus on is very much the ball's entirely in your court on that. But focus at some level sounds like a good idea.
And I'd just add to that when we were developing the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, we spent, again, a lot of time defining what a challenge was. And I think we came up with the wisdom that it really is going to depend on what sector you're in. And the creative industries are such a diffuse, different sectors. You know, you can't define it that tightly. But do have a look maybe at what some of the other research councils' challenges might look like, because you will see that they are focused. There is they are working towards a solution, even if they don't know quite what that is. So by being diffuse, don't lose focus.
Okay, I think we've got time for a few more. Let's go at the back, and then let's go here. Oh, and yeah, let's go to the lady with the headscarf, and then along, and then coming forwards, and then that might do it if we're not to cut short the panel.
Hi there. So what role does cultural and gender diversity play in the programme to ensure that a wide range of traditionally underrepresented communities plays a really crucial part in the cluster programme? And then will those be kind of measured and specifically social value as well in terms of the impact? So
I think there's a number of bits to this, actually. So as we said, I think culture and gender diversity are problems that some of the creative industries have, and they're problems in a couple of different ways. One is representation within them, and another, which I think is even more important, is talent pipeline. So I think BAS has really brought out in the Bazalgette review, brought out the role that clusters can have in tapping talent. And changing the nature of access, much more diverse access into the creative industries. I think with this programme, how that's reflected again has to come from the clusters. So what are the challenges? Are there challenges in there about representation within certain business sectors? Are there challenges that are addressable by R&D? Or is it about addressing those challenges through the work by ensuring that, that access into that research programme is kind of appropriate. So I think there's some of the issues that are within this programme and some within the wider questions within the clusters, and some of the other partners in a cluster, particularly economic development agencies, I think have got a huge role to play in aligning their strategies. But one of the key ones there, I think, one really, really important one is future talent. And in fact, to go back to the Brexit argument, is where, you know, that becomes even more compounded. How do we make sure that we're accessing the best talent in the UK into these programmes? But do you know?
I have nothing really to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of how the actual programme is reviewed and in terms of how it's put together, we're obviously completely committed to our cross-council equality and diversity policies as well. So, and we do monitor those in terms of applications. And we have a regular cross-council working group that looks at that kind of thing. So we'll ensure that that is, a core part of the way that we run this programme.
But I think the key will be the partnerships as they come together, trying to frame up some of those issues as challenges, and actually coming from the cluster itself. Should we go middle of that row, and then there was down the front on the halfway down on the aisle, and then I think we'll probably move to the panel.
Hiya, thanks. Paul Thompson from Leeds Beckett. So following on from that point, what role do local authorities, councils and maybe broader LEPs, local enterprise partnerships, what part can they play in that cluster, particularly with the artist development or talent development pipeline?
So I think we think of the LEPs and the various architectures of local regional government that we've got across the UK now as kind of key partners in those. Some of those organisations have really well developed strategies around the creative industries and the creative industry's contribution to growth and to placemaking. So we'd expect those partnerships that can to align themselves with those strategies, because everybody gets more bang for their buck that way. They get more impact. It's also worth recognising that some of the UK's most identified creative clusters so far have grown without a huge contribution from the LEPs. There's a lot of diversity in how advanced they are. I mean, I think Greater Manchester, we heard earlier, has got a really sophisticated strategy. But, you know, what role have the LEP played in the Bristol Bath creative cluster? Not much so far, although that's changing.
Yeah. I think we've recently been having conversations with the network of the LEPs, of the heads of the LEPs recently. So we did a presentation about this programme to them around about a week ago. And in general, they're very, very supportive of it. And in fact, some of the speakers that we've had at the previous events have been from LEPs, you know, and one of them, I think the Birmingham one, was more or less committing to the fact that they would be prepared to support the programme, you know, financially as well.
Yeah, so they're very keen to reappear on that Nesta map at some point.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think they're obviously going to play a big part in it, and they're very aware of the programme and what the programme's intending to do, and of course they're going to support it, because if it's going to lead to regional regeneration and growth in the creative industries, I think that's going to be, you know, how could they argue with that, really? So.
And we don't underestimate how hard that is to get that dialogue going, and some people will have it in place, some people won't have it in place, but we do want you to articulate where you're at the moment and what you're trying to achieve with those partners.
Yeah, and I would just emphasise that it's that partnership again, and it comes down to the particular cluster.
Yeah.
To define that partnership.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take one last question, I think, and then we'll move forward with the panel, who will tease some of these things out a bit further.
Hi, Ed Matthews, for Creative Lancashire. My question was, original question was partly answered through Ace's question about the challenge and about how specific you actually need the challenges to be and what are the drivers around that. But I've got another question as well about, in terms of, I get the message that it's very much about established clusters where we'll have the impact, but I'm less sure about where you sit on maybe those places where there's maybe a cluster, but those clusters are less understood in terms of how they relate to those maybe more established ones, and where they have a key role, as mentioned before by my colleagues in Yorkshire.
Really interesting question. Really, really interesting question. I was at an event, speaking at an event last night for Weave, who are, you know, East Cheshire, I think. So it's, I think one of the things there is, at this stage, we are talking about established clusters, but I think that those established clusters themselves have networks. So you could say there's a really interesting, how do the cluster, just because I was there last night, how do the clusters in East Cheshire, so the games cluster around Wilmslow, Macclesfield, or the clusters in is it called, I don't think it's even called West Cheshire, is it? But south of Ellesmere, which are more technology focused, how do they play into the clusters, what you'd think of as more classical kind of Greater Manchester or Merseyside clusters? So I think, again, at this stage with this programme, we are focusing on established clusters, but I think the interaction between those almost satellite or emerging clusters is a really, and how they relate to bigger conurbations is a really interesting one, and one, you know, I think we'd be very interested in seeing, because you know, it's not, as I explained to me last night, Macclesfield, it's not just about property values being so much cheaper, but it is partly about that in terms of where the creative workforce wants to live.
Yeah, and I think I'd just build on what Andrew said by saying, you know, it is down to the cluster to really define what that extra impact is going to be. So, you know, building on the existing established clusters, if you are bringing in some of these more satellite areas, what is the impact going to be? What is the value? Because as we've said, this is different money. It does have strings. We do need to be able to prove what the growth has been, what the impact has been. So if you can demonstrate that, go for it.
Okay, thank you. The bid writing session this afternoon can explore a lot of these things, I think, further in terms of practicalities for the next stage. Thank you to Dylan, thank you to Alex. If you can resume your seats, then what we're going to move on to is Anthony and a panel to tease out perhaps some of the challenges from, and also the opportunities from some of the different perspectives that we might bring into the partnership.
going across the panel, I've got Sarah Elderkin, who looks after creative economy at Manchester City Council, and we must have been in a room in Brighton, because I'm from down there at some point, or I live down there. Dawn Paine, who's the CMO and Chief Strategy Officer at Creative England, and Roger down the far end from FACT, who I think you look after big university partnership with FACT as well, don't you, as well as being in charge of innovation? You do, great. So I'm going to start us on questions around partnerships and how they work in practice, not our partnerships, sort of your experience of building partnerships and making them work in practical terms, because everybody will have got the message that this is all about the relationships between the industries and the HEIs, and lots of different ways of going about that. So I'm going to start with Roger, if it's all right with you, Roger. How do you put together those kind of partnerships? I don't mean the kind of legals. I mean, how do you actually make them work so that they effectively deliver what you promise?
I think if you'll indulge me for a second as an audience, I'm going to come around to answering your question in a moment. But I think one of the reasons why I've been asked to be on the panel as well is because of a piece of work that we're doing with ERDF at the minute, and this is a roundabout way of answering your question. Yeah. So the LCR Activate program is funded by the ERDF. They've been mentioned before. It's around about £5 million project, of which £2.5 million of that is matched by the partners. Now, as far as I'm aware in this call, I think I'm not that clear about what the match situation is in terms of the partners that come together around this, or whether there's match expected from the creative and digital industries as well. But there certainly is in the ERDF program. In that partnership, which is 3 years in length, began in July. In fact, we actually launched it at FACT last week. The partnership is the LEP. It's led by LJMU and FACT. So there's a distribution of the outputs from that partnership as well, and hopefully we'll get around to talking about outputs as well. Because it's the RDF, it's got very clear outputs that you have to achieve, or actually you run the risk of actually having to pay the money back. So that idea of having research funding from the AHRC with the possibility of having to pay that back is quite an interesting one. I'm interested in exploring. Whether you put into a bid the fact that if you don't achieve what you say you're going to achieve, well, we'll give the AHRC or DCMS the money back. We'll see about that. So that partnership in terms of how it came about. So we saw the RDF call. We have our executive director, Joe Wright, who sits on the digital board of the local LEP. We have long and deep relationships with Liverpool John Moores University. In fact, as an organisation, work closely in a fairly peripatetic way. So we jump from project to project with the creative and digital industries in Liverpool, primarily in the Liverpool city centre. So I think really, in real terms, the partnership is partly strategic because we're already embedded in certain areas of those partners' activities. We are interested in where the crossover is between artistic practice, an exhibition program, and creative and entrepreneurial artists, academics, and businesses. So I've kind of gone around the houses a little bit in sort of answering that question, but I think really the partnership comes together, probably at this stage, certainly in this call, in those relationships that you already have. And I certainly would, if you don't have already, encourage everyone to talk to their local LEP, because they're going to be key to unlocking a lot of fast-tracked relationships with the creative and digital industries in your region.
Okay, that's great. That's one perspective, a really interesting one on that particular programme and partnership and your strategy for it. Dawn, Creative England has and looks after some really interesting sort of partnership type projects. Like There's the big guy, little guy sort of supply chain sort of project, etc. So what's your take on why successful partnerships that you've been involved in Creative England? You're from rather like me, you're from a commercial background, so the notion of partnership is not extraordinarily, it's not antithetical to the commercial world. There's a sort of great notion that partnerships are done in pursuit of funding. Partnerships are done in pursuit of things working. Creative England, how do they work? And secondarily, what have you noticed that's different or not different since coming into the public sector?
Okay, so I think just maybe for the benefit of everyone in the audience, just a really quick précis of I guess what we as Creative England are doing, because I think we started as a film investor and we've changed quite dramatically as an organisation over the last 5 or 6 years. So in essence what we do is develop our country's creative SME and individual creative talent, and that's at the heart of what we do as a not-for-profit. So we invest in, champion and support and grow businesses operating across film, television, games, VR, AR, tech. So right at that kind of intersection between creativity and tech. So in terms of the kind of the partnerships that we do, we have we're a small organisation, but even though we're a not-for-profit, we're incredibly commercial in terms of our approach. So when we invest in SMEs, of which we've invested about £35 million over the last 5 or 6 years, they are investments. We are not handing out in the main soft money, because we want those guys to succeed and perform, so that we have an incredibly rigorous process in terms of how we actually invest in those guys, whether that be through equity, whether that be through revenue shares. And really, for anyone to get a penny out of us, you have to be a really kind of high growth, really ambitious, really great company that's got loads of potential. And in a way, I think that's quite helpful in terms of for them then to go on and grow their business and broker partnerships. They know how commercial they need to be in terms of how they go to market. So the kind of partnerships that we've done can be really kind of varied, and there's no kind of actually one kind of solution kind of fits all. So some of the things that we will be doing would be working with cultural organisations. We could be working with Greater Manchester, so we work with the Manchester Growth Hub, and we've actually created a programme with those guys called ProConnect, which is around how do we develop and support film and TV production companies in the Greater Manchester region. We invest in them, we put wraparound support around those companies. In Leeds, we've got a programme called Games Lab Leeds, where we work with the Leeds LEP. We work with York University and give them kind of help and support around the work that they're doing. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we have actually more commercial partnerships in place as well. So we work with Microsoft with a programme that's now in its 4th year called Green Shoots, where we essentially scout and identify up-and-coming games companies that we invest in, and Microsoft essentially pay us for those services because it helps them to kind of scout that new talent. So really varied. But I think that the piece that you've just touched on there, Anthony, which is something that I'm personally really passionate about, which is really, in terms of creative cluster development and ecosystem and supply chain development, where it becomes really quite transformational is when you can get the really big corporate players involved, because that's where you can kind of scale and really kind of pivot both individual companies and also the region and the creative community. So that's a key part of our strategy, really, which is, you know, bluntly, people like myself have been brought into Creative England because I've got good networks, I've worked at big companies, I've worked at incredibly entrepreneurial companies like Nintendo, and then I've worked at some of the companies that Alex talked about before, which were big Hollywood film studios that were perhaps at the less innovative end of the spectrum. And really, what I'm passionate about is joining the dots, creating connections and opportunities with those big companies to really kind of learn and develop from working with the agility and the speed of the SMEs. And for the SMEs, of course, it's an opportunity for them to scale and grow. Okay. And I guess in answer to your question around have I kind of found my move from 20 odd years of kind of leadership roles in the private sector into public sector, for me it was actually a personal choice around wanting to give back and do something entrepreneurial and different. I find it slightly bonkers, if I'm completely honest with you, in so much as it's a complex kind of landscape, and I think one of the key things that we would be wanting to kind of help and support bids around is really, when you create a great partnership, it's anchored in simplicity and it's anchored in reciprocity. And from a commercial organisation's perspective, it has to be rooted in, but of course there'll be an element of CSR, and we want to innovate for the benefit of UK Creativity PLC, but essentially as a corporate organisation, there'll be a short-term objective around what's the impact going to be to the bottom line. And I think that's perhaps part of what we can bring to the party in terms of bringing a little bit of that commercial thinking into play.
It's really valuable. So I'm going to come to you in a sec. So a couple of things have come out from what you were saying and from what Roger was saying. So there's a question about match, which is, so it sort of goes to reciprocity. You may have clocked that it is possible in this programme to give money from the programme to SMEs. It's not usual in a HE, Research Council call. It is not. Actually, I say it's possible. It is strongly recommended that you understand how you will do that inside your organisation. Doesn't mean there can't be industry match, but it does mean that entities can actually, through whatever mechanism you choose, fellowship or grants or whatever it is, there are ways of them actually being able to spend the time with you. Having headed an SME from none people to 60 people, you just have no ability to do that most of the time unless there's some kind of money involved in the reasonable short term. So that's a kind of reciprocity point. The point about simplicity, I would say, also comes to structure, and these partnerships being true, being genuinely real, trying to do the same things type partnerships. I've been in a bunch of partnerships, both public and private sector, where I come out feeling I've had partnership done to me by somebody. And it's not probably a good day to talk about, the behavioural issues around partnerships, but it's got to be genuinely true. And I'll come back to that in the context of measurement in a minute. So Sarah, you're the person with the word partnership in your job role or in your department. How does what we've been saying today feel from a city council, from a kind of public sector position?
Well, drawing from, I think, Andrew's comment earlier that, it's so rare that we get an opportunity to do something as inventive with a decent amount of investment as this. What's really crucial is not to cock it up. And learning as much from partnerships that haven't worked as those that have, getting the partnership right is just such a critical part of the recipe for success, isn't it? And
that begs the question, tell me about some partnerships that haven't worked.
Well, I would say if you haven't got somebody, that director role at the top, who's got the ability to kick people up the arse when things are going awry, then you're going to really struggle.
Strong, clear leadership is the jargon, I suppose, but yeah, I'm completely with you.
And that has been touched on, the idea of having something structural as well as really practical is critical. And maybe one of the things that's not come up, or maybe is kind of fairly implicit with the idea that this programme has got to deliver the outcomes and some direct tangible benefits, is exit. And is there something in terms of the creation of those partnerships for these programmes where you're embedding that thinking right from the very start of it? This sort of money is pretty rare, and this sort of investment is very rare. So how are we going to learn through delivering this work so that that knowledge is embedded at a local cluster level, within the LEPs, within regional structures, as well as informing future national policy? So is there some way in which you can embed that at an early point within the partnership? I wonder whether that would be a good approach as well.
It's really wise advice, I think, that. I mean, we were saying at one of the other sessions that how do you know whether a cluster is established? And to some extent, that's a historical statement. There's this and there's data and there are these things. To some extent, that is a statement about the present, because there is a challenge and it is credible and you can actually evidence that the cluster and the partnership can do it. To some extent, it's a kind of vision statement about where you'll be at the end. Yeah. And why this will have actually developed the cluster in a meaningful way, and why, from a helicopter strategy position, chair of this thing, we have to explain the whole thing worked like that for the UK as well. It's going to bring us to measurement, this conversation, in a minute, and questions that were coming legitimately from the floor. But I'm not going to let you go on other things that can go wrong. All of you, things that can and have gone wrong. In partnerships, which we should be aware of when we're assessing and when people are coming to us. Roger, thoughts?
Well, actually, yeah, we've just started, so we're not sure if what's going to go wrong.
You've done things before. You've done things before. Come on.
But I do want to pick up on, before I get to answer that question, I'm terrible for doing this, swerving it while I'm thinking about it in the background.
Keep doing it. Go on.
I just wanted to pick up something that Dawn was saying, which I think is critical to making this work. Now, from my point of view, the focus of the project that we're doing with the RDF is on SMEs. Yes, there is a relationship between big business and SMEs in terms of talent pipeline, and that's got to be should be recognised, I think, in the bids, and I would expect the AHRC to expect that too. But as it was stated earlier, 92%, certainly in the Liverpool City region that we're working in, are micro SMEs. One of the key things that we do in terms of this program, the LCR Activate program, is unlocking some of the resources in the Liverpool City region, i.e. The Hartree Centre at the STFC Daresbury in Halton. And they were set up to support creative industries in the first instance, but really it's just the big businesses who use their capabilities there. It's the Jaguars and Unilevers of this world. What we're trying to do is unlock those capabilities for smaller micro and SME, smaller businesses and micros, but ones which are demonstrating small growth. So I think don't just concentrate on the big businesses. It probably look good in your bid, but it doesn't necessarily ultimately help the overall creative industries in your region. And in terms of what's gone wrong, I think speed is a big issue. So if you're dealing with creative and digital industries, they move very fast, they're very fleet of foot, they're very agile. If you're dealing with the cultural sector that I work in, it's sort of medium pace. If you're dealing with the university sector, it's a very slow pace in comparison. So actually getting those people with entrepreneurial thinking in your HEIs to lead on this, who recognise the differences in speed and are concise, unlike me, is very important, because I've seen things fail before.
So I had a VC on the panel in Birmingham, so David Eastwood, who's the VC of Birmingham, and he said to me in public, on camera, there is nothing that is worth doing in a university that cannot be done in 48 hours. And I said, that's because you can kick asses from the top. I didn't quite say that, but that's broadly what I said. And he said, yes, it is. To which I said, how do we ensure that there's senior level input into all of these bids then, so that when the said things need kicking in the HEI, somebody's there who's got their boots? To which he said, I refer you to my previous statement. A top tip, really top tip. We've been doing this from the HRC level. If you haven't got active buy-in that goes beyond, yes, go on, put it in, from the research office, we will know. We will bloody well know. So find that top level buy-in and match it in industry. If there's a guy from the smallest web agency in Bolton is the top guy you've got, it's not about scale, but that's all you've got, and you've got somebody in the research office and nobody else, we will know. Play seriously. I said to David Eastwood as well, he's on the HRC Council, he was very keen that the bids had to be matched at a significant level by the HEIs, so they know they're in a game. They know they're playing, because the medics don't go for £1 million. They don't, and so it's at a certain scale for a reason, and we're unapologetic about that, because that was the only way we got it through the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund process. We would not have got this away fiddling around the margins with little ideas. So sorry to sound blunt, but that's just true. Dawn, back to you, and I'm coming. So questions about partnerships, and then we're going to come to measurement.
I guess just on the point around the SMEs and the big companies, I wouldn't disagree actually, in terms of actually at the end of the day, the vast majority, in terms of when we start to talk about industry, the key constituent base will of course be SMEs, because there are far more of them. But it's still to make the point that where possible, it's obviously transformational if you can manage to hook in an anchor tenant, so to speak, in the form of a big corporate. I think in terms of how to kind of best make relationships work, I would completely agree with the point around you've got to get the big cheeses engaged in this, because otherwise we've tried to do partnerships in the past where you kind of just go round in circles. You then manage to get the CEO into the room and then things kind of start moving. So I would completely echo that. I think The trick, though, I think, is that even though you need the kind of most senior level of engagement from all the different kind of players, it kind of comes back to the diversity piece around having all the different skill sets around the table. So you haven't just got your strategists and your people that have kind of got the big visionary thinking.
Somebody's got to do it as well.
You need to doers. I need doers totally around me, otherwise nothing would ever get done.
Right.
So I think that kind of mix of kind of talent skills. But I think there's just a really important bit of get the right people on the bus, sat on the table together. And I kind of think that keeping the clarity and the simplicity and the really clear sense of purpose around what you're trying to do, because I think we'll have all been involved in projects that were a bit woolly in terms of what they were trying to do. I think it's kind of keep that sense of purpose at the heart of all of your project planning.
Great. So, Sarah, your perspective on that then? Because you're from a design background, I think, aren't you? Which is, to characterise something very simply this way, is about taking things away, finding the purpose, and then taking and making the minimum perfect thing. How do you do that in a public sector context, where everybody's got complex new things to bring, and there's more complexity, and you've got to interlock it with the whole of the creative economy, and what about the cultural sector? How do you actually do the clarity of that, and how do you avoid it going wrong?
I think it is a comms piece, really. It's having the right people who can sell the idea, but not oversell it to those that are being involved in the partnership, because really the root of this brief is about generosity. I think it's about really understanding that the UK has got a really exciting opportunity, and within the creative industries, if we don't up our game now, then we're going to have some serious problems. So actually the generosity is about not just individual commercial benefit, it's also about thinking about the cluster, it's about thinking about the place, but it's also about thinking about the UK. And if you can try to find the right people with the sort of the generosity of spirit and the sense of vision, where they can buy into a project like this, where they know that potentially it's not necessarily going to impact on them. The number of HEIs that might be involved in a collaborative initiative, I think what's really interesting about this is the challenge that poses to them in terms of direct financial benefits that they may be able to get out of a project like this. Right. They need to be buying into this because they know that having a really successful creative industries sector in their cluster, in their town, their city, their region, is also going to be feeding their future business. So it's very much of sort of a visionary piece of work, and getting the right people around the table who've got that sense of spirit, that sense of generosity and that approach is really critical. It's not an easy task.
No, it's not. I'm glad you think it's trying to do that, because that is what we were setting out to achieve. But there was an interesting question about, does the way we've constructed it mean there could never be two successful bids in one region? There's a bit of blunt politics about the place agenda and London in that, because you spend all this money inside the M25, and I don't live in London. I have lived in London. I'm from up here. There is a totally good argument on international scale, being blunt, for spending all of it in the M25, but that's not the objective, and that shouldn't be the objective. That'd be the objective when we get to £1 billion a year, not to 55 million or 50 million. But it is possible to find clusters, and there are clusters, a number of them, and this and Yorkshire may well be two of them, where there could well be competing bids. In which case, the fit to the strategy, the city council, the metropolitan authority, or the nation's policy will be really significant. As that question was coming, I was thinking, I can't think of a challenge that will be specific enough that will allow all the HEIs in a region to claim it's genuinely a cluster-driven, industry-driven challenge. I just don't know what that is, because I think it sounds like creative industries, what's going to happen there then? Talk about that for a bit. It doesn't sound specific enough even at the first level. But what if you end up with 3 in Manchester that come forwards? I'm not going to ask you to pick, but their relationship to your policy might well be a key determinant of what really is reflecting the cluster. Is that a credible situation, that we might not get 3, but that 3 things could come out of a region like yours that actually do have a good solid fit to your policy?
thankfully, I don't think it's the case. Okay. So maybe tell me later if anyone thinks it is.
It's not, is it?
It would be problematic. But I think what's clear when we looked at those cluster maps that Michael took us through earlier, there are, and Andrew as well, there are different clusters for different parts of the sector. We've got this incredibly diverse sector that we're talking about here. And so if you had 3 really solid proposals that were looking at particular aspects of the creative industries, then maybe there is a case. And then you say, well, how can you learn and come together and use an economy of scale in terms of a joint approach, perhaps?
Right.
So that's how I would look at it. Total, it's an absolute nightmare and just incredibly weak if you end up with, 2 contrasting proposals around the same bit of the subsector.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. It saved me saying it. There's also a significant component, as somebody said, we've had a LEP on a panel effectively getting his checkbook out. We have had nations governments suggesting that this is very central to the long-term role of the creative industries in their nation. So, we had the mayor of, he's West Midlands, isn't he, Andy Street? So we had the mayor of West Midlands effectively saying, come on then, ask me a question, tell me how much. And that will clearly be relevant, but it will only be relevant in the sense that if the cluster is at that scale, there is a challenge and it needs that level of support. But it is an operative factor, actually how serious the match and the scale of these things actually turns out to be. And to come to company involvement for a minute, one of my roles is to talk to the national level companies. I go straight into lunch with senior BBC people, for instance, to talk about their role. We've been to Facebook, I'm talking to Google, we're talking to games companies. Advertising companies about their roles. But you can go and talk to them in the cluster as well. But it may be that some of them come in at the national level down the line. We don't know yet. We're going so fast to try and do any of this stuff. It's hard enough to get the meeting in the timescale at the BBC than to do this. So just to close then, we had a question about measurement and not over-measuring. And we had a very clear response from Alex, and it was absolutely correct, and she's not left now, so I can say this. Absolutely correct response that this will be very measured. What I would have said, were I standing up at that point, was yes, but we haven't decided how. And it might change over time. So talk to me a bit about effective measurement. Roger first, now I'm going to come down the panel.
Well, as was mentioned earlier, this isn't ERDF, but with ERDF projects, there comes absolutely clear outputs which you have to achieve. X number of businesses assisted to grow, X number of new employees and full-time equivalent, X number of new products to market, X number of new products to the business, and so on. If you don't achieve these, there are penalties. So that's a great motivator for 2 partners who really aren't generally measured on, let's say, their achievements of that nature, let's say, in their day-to-day activity. I worry as well that it was mentioned a couple of times today, don't muck this up. I think we want to be careful of introducing this idea of fear as well into the proposal. I think the difference sometimes in the culture of entrepreneurship between, say, the UK and the United States is there is a fear of mucking it up. And that probably is augmented by the fact there's a certain level of precarity in both the education and cultural sectors. But yeah, in terms of measurement and outputs. So yes, if we don't reach those outputs that we've said, then there will be sort of penalties involved.
Okay,
and I'd be interested to see if any other proposals build that in.
It's interesting. Yeah, KPIs as a point of difference. Suggesting KPIs as a USP for your bid. There's an idea. It's a bit meta even for me, but I like it. Dawn, thoughts on measurement? What we tips for us, ideas that you've learned from other places?
I think a little bit that, I think as Roger was just saying, I think the challenge is that on the one hand, we kind of need to be rigorous, and on the other hand, you need to be brave and expansive, and it is a really difficult thing to reconcile those 2 things. I guess from my time at Nintendo, which was a company that was, it's had a 120-year history of huge successes, huge failures, and pretty much nothing in between. That 10-year period there has stayed with me for a long time, and I think for me, I would always be erring on the side of, a key KPI is transformation into something that you perhaps didn't even expect. And I know that's really difficult to quantify, but I do think that the bravery and the transformational piece somehow has to be, I think, reflected in this, as well as all of those core bread and butter KPIs around, business growth, scale up, economic impact, and all the rest of it. And I guess the other thing perhaps as well to think about is, even though we're looking at this clearly on a very regionalised, cluster-by-cluster basis, maybe another metric of success could be kind of the national scaling piece, that it becomes so kind of thought-leading and market-leading that it actually becomes something for the benefit of UK PLC rather than just the region.
Interesting, good call. Sarah?
I'm just wondering whether or not it's worth building into in each individual programme a level of baselining that perhaps goes beyond some of the broader research that might already exist. So if you think you're going to be pinpointing on a particular challenge, a particular problem or a particular opportunity, it's actually starting with really interrogating that so that you've got an evidence base that you can respond to at the end of the project. It would, as well as echo Dawn and Roger's comments too.
Great, thank you. Really interesting. Always get good tips on this bit, don't we, for what we should think about, and they're always more complex than they make everything even more complex. But that's a good thing, I think. So I'm going to close with a couple of thoughts on that came from what I thought was an absolutely extraordinary presentation by Alex. I was looking forward to it, and it was, that thing you should never meet your heroes, they always say, because they always disappoint you. Just didn't disappoint me in any way. Don't know if he's in the room, but my God, it was amazing. He talked about, there was a thing I took away from it, which was extraordinary detail, preparation, really anti-disciplinary in the term I like, thinking about those big questions, which leads to stories about the future. It's not a bad metaphor for a good bid for this. Something which is actually rooted in the detail of what you're going to do, but where the detail can persuade us, which allows us to persuade somebody else that you're going to actually make the impact you say you're going to make. And that is about, not fear, that's about risk. It's about an attitude to risk. And in the public sector and a lot of the funding sector, risk is mitigated, and in the commercial sector, it is taken in a calm way. Now, that is a ridiculously oversimplistic statement. But those two things have come out really strong for me here. Not as much in other areas, but hey, we're in the Northwest. Sorry, those of you from the other side of the Pennines, thank you for coming. We'll stamp your passports on the way back. But those two things are really important to me. There's a lot of detailed work to be done which delivers a vision which feels credible, but it's still a story about the way you think the future might shape up as a result of spending this money. And you shouldn't be shying away from that into a place where you're not taking any risk. That's basically what we did to get the money in the first place. We did as much work as we could on the detail of why it should be done, why it was important, and market failure arguments and scale up and inward investment. And then we said, and just think what it'd be like if we get it right. Which is a really simple thing to say, but it actually worked. So given that it worked at the program level, it might work at the bid level. Look, this afternoon you're going to be doing detailed bid preparation workshop. I hope you had an inspiring, interesting morning. I'm going to hand to Andrew to just close this session, I think. Am I? I've done it. I've just done it. Thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch. If you're coming back this afternoon, please do.